Chapter 1. The Fledgling. A man's alter ego is nothing more than his favorite image of himself. The mirror in my room in the Windsor Hotel in Paris showed my favorite image of me, a handsome young airline pilot, looking perfect with a smooth skin and bull shoulders. Modesty is not one of my virtues. At the time, virtue was not one of my virtues. Satisfied with my appearance, I picked up my bag, left the room, and 2 minutes later was standing in front of the cashier at the hotel reception. "Good morning, Captain," said the cashier in her warm tone. The markings on my uniform identified me as a first officer, a co-pilot, but the French are like that. They often make a mistake in rating everything too high except their women, wine, and art. I signed the hotel bill she handed me across the counter, started to turn away, then turned back, taking a payroll check from the inside pocket of my jacket. "Oh, can you cash this for me? Your Paris nightlife left me without any money, and it'll be another week before I'm home." I smiled sadly. She picked up the Pan American World Airways check and looked at the amount. "I'm sure we can, Captain, but I must get the manager's approval of a check because it is large," she said. She stepped into an office behind her and was back in a moment, showing a pleased smile. She handed me the check to sign. "I think you want American dollars?" she asked, and without waiting for my reply counted out $786.73 in Yankee currency in coin. I pushed back two $50 bills. "Please take care of the necessary people, since I was so careless," I said, smiling. She beamed happily. "Of course, Captain." "You are very kind," she said. "Have a safe flight and please come back to see us." I took a cab to Orly, instructing the driver to stop at the TWA entrance. I passed the TWA ticket counter in the lobby and presented my FAA license and Pan Am ID card to the TWA operations officer. He checked his manifest. "Okay, First Officer Frank Williams, a deadhead to Rome. Fill this out, please." He handed me the familiar pink form and I wrote the necessary data. I picked up my bag and walked to the customs gate marked "Crew members only." I started to lift my bag to the counter, but the inspector recognized me and let me through. A young boy watched me as I walked to the plane, looking with admiration at my uniform with its polished gold stripes and other decorations. "You the pilot?" he asked. He was English from his accent. "Nah, just a passenger like you," I replied. "I fly for Pan Am." "You fly Boeing 707s? I shook my head. "Right now I'm on a different plane," I said. "I like kids." This one reminded me of myself a few years ago. An attractive blonde stewardess met me as I stepped aboard and helped me to put my things in the crew's luggage section. "We are full this trip, Mr. Williams," she said. "You won the jump seat that two other guys wanted to take. I'll be serving the cabin." "Just milk for me," I said. "And don't worry about that if you get busy. Deadheads can't have anything more than the ride." I went into the cabin. The pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer were pre-checking their takeoff equipment, but they paused courteously at my entrance. "Hi, Frank Williams, Pan Am, and don't let me interrupt you," I said. "Gary Giles," said the pilot, offering his hand. He nodded toward the other two men. "Bill Austin, number 2, and Jim Wright. Good to have you with us." I shook hands with the other two pilots and dropped into the jump seat, leaving them to their work. We took off within 20 minutes. Giles checked his instruments, spoke with the Orly airport, and then stood up from his seat. He examined me casually and then pointed at his chair. "Why don't you fly this bird for a while, Frank?" he said. I'll go back and speak with the passengers. His offer was a courtesy gesture toward a deadheading pilot from a competing airline. I dropped my cap on the cabin floor and sat into his seat, understanding very well that I was given custody of 140 lives, my own included. Austin, who took the controls when Giles left his seat, passed them to me. "You got it, Captain," he said with a wide smile. I quickly put the plane on automatic pilot and hoped to hell the gadget worked, because I couldn't fly a kite. I wasn't a Pan Am pilot or any other kind of pilot. I was an imposter, one of the most wanted criminals on 4 continents, and at the moment I was doing my thing, playing a super trick on some nice people. I was a millionaire twice before I was 21. I stole every nickel of it and blew the money on fine clothes, delicious foods, luxurious apartments, fantastic girls, big cars, and other nice things. I had parties in every capital in Europe, relaxed on all the famous beaches, and spent good time in South America, Asia, and Africa. It wasn't quite a relaxing life. I didn't exactly keep my finger on the panic button, but I had to make a lot of escapes through side doors, down fire escape stairs, or over roofs. I left more wardrobes in 5 years than most men buy in a lifetime. It may seem strange, but I never felt like a criminal. I was one, of course, and I was aware of the fact. I was described by news reporters as one of this century's cleverest check swindlers and fraud artists who deserved Academy Award. I was a con man of astonishing ability. I sometimes astonished myself with some of my impersonations and tricks, but I never at any time deceived myself. I was always aware that I was Frank Abagnale, Jr., that I was a check swindler and an imposter, and if and when I were caught I wasn't going to win any Oscars. I was going to jail. I was right. I did time in a French small jail, in a Swedish prison, and cleaned myself of all my American sins in the Petersburg, Virginia, federal jail. While in the last prison, I volunteered to pass a psychological test. The criminologist psychiatrist from University of Virginia spent 2 years giving me various written and oral tests, using truth serum injections and polygraph examinations. The shrink concluded that I had a very low criminal threshold. In other words, crime wasn't my natural quality. One of the New York cops, who had worked hardest to catch me, read the report and laughed. "This head doctor must be kidding us," he said angrily. "This swindler deceives several hundred banks, steals everything except the sheets from half the hotels in the world, uses every airline in the skies, including most of their stewardesses, produces enough bad checks to cover the walls of the Pentagon with them as wallpaper, supports his own damned colleges and universities, makes half the cops in 20 countries look like idiots while he's stealing over $2 million. And he has a low criminal threshold? What the hell would he do if he had a high criminal threshold, rob Fort Knox?" The detective faced me with the paper. "You deceived this shrink, didn't you, Frank?" I told him I had answered every question as truthfully as possible, that I had done every test as honestly as I could. I didn't convince him. "No," he said. "You can fool these feds, but you can't fool me." "You tricked this shrink." He shook his head. "You would trick your own father, Frank." I already had. My father was the first one in my score. Dad had one necessary quality for that blind trust, and I robbed him for $3,400.1, was only 15 at the time. I was born and spent my first 16 years in New York's Bronx. I was the third of 4 children and had my dad's name. I was the product of a broken home, for Mom and Dad separated when I was 12. The person most hurt by the divorce was Dad. He was really in love with Mom. My mother, Paulette Abagnale, is a French-Algerian beauty whom Dad met and married during his World War II Army service in Algeria. Mom was only 15 at the time, and Dad was 28, and though the difference in ages didn't seem to matter at that time, I've always felt it had an influence on the breakup of their marriage. Dad opened his own business in New York City after the war, a stationery store. He was very successful. We lived in a big, luxurious home, and if we weren't extremely rich, we were certainly quite rich. My brothers, my sister, and I never needed anything during our early years. A kid is often the last to know when there's serious trouble between his parents. I know that's true in my case. I thought Mom was happy to be a housewife and mother, and she was, up to a point. But Dad was more than just a successful businessman. He was also very active in politics. He was a member and president of the New York Athletic Club, and he spent a lot of his time at the club with both business and political friends. Dad was also a fisherman. He was always flying off to Puerto Rico or some other place on deep-sea fishing expeditions. He never took Mom along, and he should have. And one day Dad came back to find his home empty. Mom had packed the things and moved herself, us 3 boys and our sister, into a large apartment. We kids were a bit surprised, but Mom quietly explained that she and Dad decided to live apart. Well, she had decided to live apart anyway. Dad was shocked, surprised, and hurt at Mom's action. He begged her to come back home, promising he would be a better husband and father, and that he would stop his deep-sea expeditions. He even offered to give up politics. Mom listened, but she made no promises. And it soon became obvious to me, if not Dad, that she wasn't going to change her mind. She went to a dental college and started training to be a dental technician. Dad didn't give up. He came to our apartment at every opportunity and begged her. Sometimes he lost his temper. "Damn it, woman, can't you see I love you?" he cried. The situation had its influence on us boys, of course. Me especially. I loved my dad. I was the closest to him, and he started to use me in his fight to win back Mom. "Talk to her, son," he asked me. "Tell her I love her. Tell her we'd be happier if we all lived together. Tell her you'd be happier if she came home, that all you kids would be happier." He gave me gifts for Mom, and instructed me how to break down my mother's resistance. But my mother couldn't be tricked. And Dad probably failed because Mom was angry that he was using me in the role of a chess piece in their game of marital chess. She divorced Dad when I was 14. Dad was broken. I was disappointed, for I had really wanted them to live together. I can say this about Dad: when he loved a woman, he loved her forever. He was still trying to win Mom back when he died in 1974. When Mom finally divorced my father, I chose to live with Dad. Mom didn't like my decision, but I felt Dad needed one of us, that he shouldn't live alone, and I persuaded her. Dad was grateful and pleased. I never regretted the decision, though Dad probably did. Life with Father was a different game. I spent a lot of time in some of New York's best bars. Businessmen, I learned, not only enjoy lunches with martini, but they are ready for scotch and soda dinners. Politicians, I also noticed quickly, were more sincere talking of world affairs and more generous to spend state budget money after a few drinks. Dad did a lot of his business and political deals close to a bar, with me waiting nearby. My father's drinking habits alarmed me at first. I didn't think he was an alcoholic, but he was a drinker, and I worried that he had a drinking problem. Still, I never saw him drunk. After living with Dad for 6 months, I was streetwise and smart, which is not exactly the kind of education Dad had in mind for me, but it's the kind you get in bars. Dad had a lot of political influence. I learned this when I started missing school and hanging out with some lazy kids from my neighborhood. They weren't gang members or anything like that. They weren't into anything really criminal. They were just guys with a bad family situation, trying to get attention from someone. Maybe that's why I started hanging out with them. Perhaps I was seeking attention myself. I really wanted my parents together again, and I thought at that time that if I had any problems, it might be a reason for them to make peace. I was much more mature than my companions and much bigger. At 15 I was physically grown, 6 feet and 170 pounds, and I guess people who saw us thought I was a teacher with some students, or a big brother looking after the younger crowd. I sometimes felt that way myself, and I was often irritated at their childishness. What bothered me most was their lack of style. I learned early that style is always admired. Almost any fault, sin or crime is taken easier if there's a touch of class. These kids couldn't even steal a car with any style. The first set of wheels they stole ended up in the police station. Dad not only got me out, but he made all mention of my part in the incident disappear from the records. Dad wasn't angry with me. "We all make mistakes, son," he said. "I know what you were trying to do, but that's not the way to do it. Under the law, you're still a child, but you're man-sized. Maybe you should start thinking like a man." I stopped hanging out with my street friends, started going to school regularly again, and got a part-time job as a shipping clerk. Dad was pleased, so pleased he bought me an old Ford, which I transformed into a real fox trap. For girls. If I had to blame anything for my future dishonest actions, I'd blame the Ford. That Ford destroyed every moral fiber in my body. It introduced me to girls, and I didn't come to my senses for 6 years. They were wonderful years. At 15 I knew about girls, of course. They were built differently than boys. But I didn't know why until I stopped at a red light one day and saw this girl looking at me in my car. When she saw she had my attention, she did something with her eyes, shook her front and her behind, and suddenly I was lost in my thoughts. She broke the barrier. I don't remember how she got into the car, or where we went after she got in, but I remember she was all silk, soft, warm, sweet, and absolutely delightful, and I knew I had found a contact sport that I could really enjoy. Women became my only pleasure. I couldn't get enough of them. I woke up thinking of girls. I went to bed thinking of girls. All lovely, leggy, fantastic, and charming. I went on girl hunting at sunrise. I went out at night and looked for them with a flashlight. Don Juan was a mild case of the hots compared to me. I was obsessed with foxy women. I needed a way to get money for my obsession. I went to Dad, who was not totally unaware of my discovery of girls. "Dad, it was really great of you to give me a car, and I feel like a fool asking for more, but I've got problems with that car," I begged. "I need a gas credit card. I only get paid once a month, and what with buying my school lunches, going to the games, dating and stuff, I don't have the money to buy gas sometimes. I'll try and pay the bill myself, but I promise I won't use your trust in the wrong way if you let me have a gas card." And I was sincere. Dad thought for a few moments, then nodded. "All right, Frank, I trust you," he said, taking his mobile card from his wallet. "You take this card and use it. I won't pay anything to mobile from now on. It'll be your card, and it'll be your responsibility to pay this bill each month when it comes in. I won't worry about it." He should have. The arrangement worked fine the first month. The mobile bill came in and I paid to the oil firm. But the payment left me without any money, and once again I found myself in a trap in my constant search for girls. I began to feel frustrated. After all, the pursuit of happiness was an inalienable American privilege, wasn't it? I felt I was deprived of a constitutional right. Someone once said there's no such thing as an honest man. He was probably a con man. It's the favorite logic of any con man. I think a lot of people imagine themselves a super criminal, an international diamond thief or something like that, but these fantasies are only daydreams. I also think a lot of other people are actually tempted now and then to commit a crime, especially if they think they won't be caught. Such people usually resist the temptation. They have an inborn knowledge of right and wrong, and common sense wins. But there's also a type of person whose competitive instincts dominate reason. They are challenged by a given situation in much the same manner a climber is challenged by a tall peak, because it's there. Right or wrong are not factors, nor are results. These people see crime as a game, and the goal is not just the money, it's the success. These people are the chess players of the criminal world. They generally have a genius-level IQ. They never expect to lose. They are always astonished when a cop with average intelligence catches them, and the cop is always astonished at their motives. Crime as a challenge? Jesus. But it was the challenge that led me to my first fraud. I needed money as usual. I stopped at a mobile station one afternoon and saw a large sign in front of the station's tire display. "Put a set on your mobile card, we'll put the set on your car," the sign read. It was the first time I realized that the mobile card was good for more than gas or oil. I didn't need any tires, the ones on the Ford were practically new, but as I studied the sign I suddenly thought of a scheme. Hell, it might even work, I thought. I got out and went to the owner of the station. We were casual acquaintances. "How much would it cost me for a set of tires?" I asked. "For this car, $160, but you got good ones," the man said. He looked at me and I knew he felt I was going to make an offer. "Yeah, I don't really need any tires," I agreed. "But I need money." "Tell you what I'll do. I'll buy a set of those tires and charge them on this card. Only I don't take the tires. You give me $100 instead. You've still got the tires, and when my dad pays mobile for them, you get your share. And when you sell the tires, the whole $160 goes into your pocket. What do you say? You'll make best profit, man." He studied me, and I could see the greed in his eyes. "What about your old man?" he asked cautiously. I shrugged. "He never looks at my car." I told him I needed some new tires and he told me to charge them. He was still doubtful. "Let me see your driver's license." "This could be a stolen card," he said. I handed him my junior driver's license, which had the same name as the card. "You're only 15? You look 10 years older," the station owner said as he handed it back. "I'll have to call into mobile and get an approval. We have to do that on any big purchase. If I get an okay, then it's a deal." I left the station with $100 in my wallet. I was crazy with happiness. I hadn't yet had my first taste of alcohol, and I couldn't compare the feeling to a champagne, say, but it was the most delightful feeling I'd ever experienced in the front seat of a car. In fact, my cleverness astonished me. If it worked once, why wouldn't it work twice? It did. It worked so many times in the next several weeks, I lost count. I can't remember how many sets of tires, how many batteries and other automobile stuff I bought with that charge card and then sold back for a part of value. Then the first month's bill came. I threw the bill into the wastebasket. A second bill mailed 2 weeks later also went there. I thought about facing Dad and confessing, but I didn't have the courage. I knew he would find out, sooner or later, but I decided someone other than me would have to tell him. Eventually, a mobile investigator found Dad in his store. The man spoke as if apologizing. "Mr. Abagnale, you've had a card with us for 15 years and we prize your account. You've got a top credit rating, you've never been late with a payment, and I'm not here to blame you about your bill," said the agent as Dad listened with a puzzled expression. "We are curious, sir, and would like to know one thing. Just how in the hell could you spend $3,400 for gas, oil, batteries, and tires for one 1952 Ford in 3 months? You've put 14 sets of tires on that car in the past 60 days and bought 22 batteries and several tons of gas in the past 90 days. Dad was astonished. "Why, I don't even use my mobile card, my son does," he said when he recovered. "There must be some mistake." The mobile investigator placed several hundred mobile charge receipts in front of Dad. Each had his signature in my handwriting. "How did he do this? And why?" Dad almost cried. "I don't know," replied the mobile agent. "Why don't we ask him?" They did. I said I didn't know anything about the swindle. I didn't convince them. I expected Dad to be very angry. But he was more puzzled than angry. "Look, son, if you tell us how you did this, and why, we'll forget it. There'll be no punishment, and I'll pay the bills," he offered. My dad was a great guy. He never lied to me in his life. I told the truth. "It's the girls, Dad," I confessed. "They do funny things to me. I can't explain it." Dad and the mobile investigator nodded with sympathy. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry about it, boy. No one can explain it," he said. If Dad forgave me, Mom didn't. She was really upset over the incident and blamed my father for my guilt. My mother still had legal custody of me, and she decided to remove me from Dad's influences. Worse still, she put me into a private school for problem boys. The school was like a summer camp. I lived in a neat cottage with 6 other boys, and except for the fact that I was not allowed to leave campus and constantly controlled, I didn't have any difficulties. We attended classes from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., from Monday to Friday, but the rest of the time was our own to do what we liked. Still, I looked on my limitation in the school as punishment, which I didn't deserve. After all, Dad had forgiven me and he was the only victim of my crimes. So what was I doing in the place? I asked myself. What I disliked most about the school, however, was its lack of girls. I became even more depressed when I knew what had happened to Dad. He never went into details, but while I was in the school he got into some serious financial difficulties and lost his business. He was forced to sell the house and his 2 big Cadillacs and everything else he had of material value. In a few months, Dad went from living like a millionaire to living like a postal clerk. That's what he was when he came to me after I had spent a year in the school. A postal clerk. Mom agreed to my living with Dad again. I was shocked at the change of his life. But Dad did not allow me to blame myself. The $3,400 I'd stolen was not a factor in his business failure, he told me. "Don't even think of it, kid." That was a drop in the bucket, he said cheerfully. He wasn't bothered by his sudden drop in status and finances, but it bothered me. Not for myself, but for Dad. I wanted him to explain the reasons. "What about your friends, Dad?" I asked. "I remember you always helped them. Didn't any of them offer to help you?" Dad just smiled. "You'll learn, Frank, that when you're up there are hundreds of people who'll call you a friend." When you're down, you're lucky if one of them will buy you a cup of coffee. If I could start it again, I'd select my friends more carefully. I have a couple of good friends. They're not rich, but one of them got me my job in the post office. He refused to speak about his misfortunes, but it bothered me, especially when I was with him in his car. It wasn't as good as my Ford, which he'd sold for me and placed the money in an account in my name. "Doesn't it bother you at all to drive this old car, Dad?" I asked him one day. "I mean, this is really a drop from a Cadillac." "Right." Dad laughed. "That's the wrong way to look at it, Frank. It's not important what a man has but what a man is. This car is fine for me. I know who I am and what I am, and that's what matters, not what other people might think of me. I'm an honest man, and that's more important to me than having a big car. As long as a man knows what he is and who he is, he'll do all right." Trouble was, at that time I didn't know what I was or who I was. Within 3 short years I had the answer. "Who are you?" asked a pretty brunette when I sat down on Miami Beach beside her. "Anyone I want to be," I said. And that was true. Chapter 2. The Pilot. I left home at 16. There was no pressure on me to leave, although I wasn't happy. The situation with my family didn't change. Dad still wanted to win Mom back and Mom didn't want to be won. Dad was still using me as a peacemaker in his attempts to win Mom back, and she was still angry about his using me in this role. I disliked it myself. Mom graduated from dental technician school and was working for a dentist. She seemed satisfied with her new, independent life. I had no plans to run away. But every time Dad put on his postal clerk's uniform and drove to work in his old car, I felt depressed. I couldn't forget how he wore branded suits and drove big expensive cars. One June morning of 1964, I woke up and knew it was time to go. Some remote corner of the world seemed to tell me, "Come." So I went. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't leave any notes behind. I had $200 in a checking account at the bank, an account Dad had opened for me a year before and which I had never used. I took my checkbook, packed my best clothes in a suitcase, and caught a train for New York City. In New York, I met a boy my own age an hour after I got off the train and tricked him into taking me home with him. I told his parents that both my mother and father died, that I was trying to live on my own, and that I needed a place to stay until I got a job. They told me I could stay in their home as long as I wanted. I had no ideas at the moment where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do. But I had a clear goal. I was going to be successful in some field. I was going to make it to the top of some mountain. And once there, no one or nothing was going to push me from the peak. I wasn't going to make the mistakes my dad had made. The Big Apple quickly proved to be less than attractive, even for a native son. I had no problem finding a job. I had worked for my father as a clerk and delivery boy and was experienced in the operation of a stationery store. I started going to large stationery firms, presenting myself truthfully. I was only 16, I said, and I was a high school dropout, but I was well experienced in the stationery business. The manager of the third firm I visited hired me at $1.50 an hour. I was naive enough to think it a good salary. I lost illusions within the week. I realized it was impossible to live in New York on $60 a week, even if I stayed in the cheapest hotel and ate hot dogs from street automats. Even more disappointing, I was left with the role of spectator in the dating game with girls. I analyzed the situation and came to this conclusion. I was paid a low salary not because I was a high school dropout but because I was only 16. A boy simply couldn't get a man's salary. So I aged 10 years overnight. It had always surprised people, especially women, to learn I was still a teenager. I decided that if I looked older, I might be older. I was good at graphic arts in school. I changed the birth date on my driver's license from 1948 to 1938. Then I went out to test the job market as a 26-year-old high school dropout, with proof of my age in my wallet. No one questioned my new age, but the best offer was $2.75 an hour as a truck driver's assistant. Some prospective employers honestly told me that it wasn't age that mattered to a worker's salary, but education. The more education he had, the more he was paid. It occurred to me only later that diplomas, like birth dates, are also easily faked. I could survive on $110 a week, but I couldn't live on that money. The girls I was dating were costing me a lot more. I started writing checks on my $200 account whenever I needed money for my dates with girls. I cashed a check for only $10, or at most $20, and at first I did all my check deals in the Manhattan Bank. Then I learned that stores, hotels, and other business firms would also cash personal checks if the amount wasn't too large and proper identification was presented. I found out that my driver's license was suitable identification, and I started to cash $20 or $25 checks at hotels and department stores. No one asked me any questions. No one checked with the bank to see if the check was good. I simply presented my fake driver's license with my check, and the driver's license was handed back with the cash. It was easy. Too easy. Within a few days I knew I had the overdraft on my account, and the checks I was writing were no good. However, I continued to cash a check whenever I needed money to finance a date with some beautiful chick. I was soon writing 2 or 3 bad checks daily because New York has more beautiful chicks than any country farm. I quit my job and began to support myself on my fake checks. I didn't keep track of the number of these checks, but my standard of living improved extremely. So did my standard of loving. After 2 months of writing bad checks, however, I faced myself with some unpleasant truths. I was a swindler. Nothing more, nothing less. That didn't bother me too much, for I was a successful swindler, and at the moment to be a success at anything was the most important factor in the world to me. What bothered me were the professional risks of being a check swindler. I knew my father had reported my absence to the police. Generally, the cops don't spend a lot of time looking for a missing 16-year-old, unless a crime is suspected. However, my case was an exception. The police, I knew, were looking for me as a thief, not a missing teenager. Every storekeeper and businessman I'd deceived had also reported on me, I supposed. In short, I was hot. I knew I could escape the cops for a while, but I also knew I would eventually be caught if I stayed in New York. The choice was to leave New York, and the prospect frightened me. That remote corner of the world suddenly seemed chilly and not friendly at all. In Manhattan, despite my independence, Mom and Dad were just a phone call or a short train trip away. I knew they would be loyal, no matter what my crimes were. I was practiced in only one art, writing fraudulent checks. I didn't even think of any other source of income, and to me that was a matter of importance. If I went to Chicago, Miami, Washington, or some other remote city, the prospect seemed depressing. Could I fool people in another city as easily as I had fooled New Yorkers? In New York I had an actual checking account and a valid driver's license, which together allowed me to do my thing. But they were useless in any other city. I had to change my name, get fake identification, and open a bank account under my alias before I could operate. It all seemed difficult and dangerous to me. I was a successful swindler. I wasn't yet a confident swindler. I was still fighting with the problems of my situation several days later when the solution came right out of the hotel doors. As I was walking along the 42nd Street near the hotel entrance, an Eastern Airlines flight crew appeared, a captain, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 4 stewardesses. They were all laughing and excited, full of a joie de vivre of their own. The men were all handsome, and their uniforms with gold emblems gave them an adventurous look. The girls were all lovely, as graceful and colorful as butterflies. I stopped and watched as they boarded a crew bus, and I thought I had never seen such a beautiful group of people. I walked on, still impressed by their glamour, and suddenly an idea occurred to me so bright and adventurous that I astonished myself. What if I were a pilot? Not an actual pilot, of course. I didn't want to waste time on years of study, training, flight school, and other dull traps to become a man for a jetliner's cabin. But what if I had the uniform of an airline pilot? Why, I thought I could walk into any hotel, bank, or business in the country and cash a check. Airline pilots are men who are admired and respected. Men who are trusted. Men with money. And you don't expect an airline pilot to be a local resident or a check swindler. I shook off the charm of the idea. It was too risky to consider. Challenging, yes, but foolish. And then I was at 42nd and Park Avenue and saw the Pan American World Airways building over me. I looked up at the high office building, and I didn't see a structure of steel, stone, and glass. I saw a mountain to be climbed. The top managers of the famous airlines were unaware of the fact, but at that moment Pan Am got its most expensive jet imposter. I sat up all night, considering my actions, and fell asleep just before dawn with a plan in mind. I woke up shortly after 1 p.m., took the yellow pages and looked up Pan Am's number. I dialed the switchboard number and asked to speak to someone in the purchasing department. I was connected at once. "This is Johnson, can I help you?" "My name is Robert Black and I'm a co-pilot with Pan American, based in Los Angeles." I paused for his reaction. My heart was beating very fast. "Yes, what can I do for you, Mr. Black?" He was courteous and formal, and I went ahead. "We flew a trip in here at 8 o'clock this morning, and I must be out of here this evening at 7, I said. I invented the flight times and hoped he wasn't familiar with Pan Am's schedules. I certainly wasn't. "Now, I don't know how this happened," I continued, trying to sound upset. "I've been with the company 7 years and never had anything like this happen. The thing is, someone has stolen my uniform, or at least it's missing, and the only uniform I have is in my home in Los Angeles. Now, I have to fly this trip out tonight, and I'm almost sure I can't do it in civilian clothes. Do you know where I can pick up a uniform here, or borrow one, just for this trip?" Johnson laughed. "Well, it's not a big problem," he replied. "Have you got a pencil and paper?" I said I did, and he continued. "Go down to the Well-Built Uniform Company and ask for Mr. Rosen. He'll fix you up. I'll call him and tell him you're coming. What's your name again?" "Robert Black," I replied, and hoped he was asking simply because he'd forgotten. "Don't worry, Mr. Black. Rosen will take good care of you," Johnson said cheerfully. Less than an hour later I walked into the Well-Built Uniform Company. "You Officer Black?" Rosen asked, and when I said I was, he pointed a finger. "Come on." I followed him past a lot of different uniforms, apparently for several different airlines, until he stopped beside a display of dark blue suits. "What's your rank?" Rosen asked, looking at jackets. I knew none of the airline terminology. Co-pilot, I said, and hoped that was the right answer. First officer, huh? He said, and began handing me jackets and trousers to try on for size. Finally, Rosen was satisfied. This isn't a perfect fit, but I don't have time to make changes. I suddenly noticed the uniform jacket and cap each lacked something. Where's the Pan Am wings and the Pan Am emblem? I asked. Rosen shrugged. Oh, we don't have those. We just manufacture uniforms. You'll have to get the wings and the emblem from Pan Am's stores department. Oh, okay, I said, smiling. How much do I pay you for this uniform? I'll write you a check. Rosen shook his head. Can't take a check or cash, shither, he said. I have to charge this to your employee account number, and it'll be taken out of your payroll check? That's the way we do it here. He handed me a form. Opposite the space for my name were 5 small connected boxes, and I assumed that they were for an employee's payroll account number. 5 boxes. 5 digits. I filled in the boxes with the first 5 numbers that came to mind, signed the form, and pushed it back to Rosen. Thank you very much, Mr. Rosen, I said, and left, carrying the lovely uniform. If Rosen answered, I didn't hear him. I went back to my room and dialed the Pan Am switchboard again. Excuse me, but I was referred to the stores department, I said, as if confused. What is that, please? I'm not with the company, and I have to make a delivery there. The switchboard girl was most helpful. It's in Hangar 14 at Kennedy Airport. Do you need directions? I said I didn't and thanked her. I took an airport bus to Kennedy and was really frightened when I found myself in front of Hangar 14. Whatever stores Pan Am kept in Hangar 14, they had to be valuable. The hangar was a fortress, surrounded by a tall fence, and its entrances were guarded by armed soldiers. Each entrance had a sign, "Employees only." A dozen or more pilots, stewardesses, and civilians entered the hangar while I was watching from the bus stop. I noticed the civilians stopped and showed identification to the guards, but most of the uniformed personnel, pilots and stewardesses, simply walked through the gate, some without even a glance at the guard. Then one turned back to say something to a guard, and I noticed he had an ID card attached to his breast pocket. It was a rainy day, and I had a raincoat with me, a black one similar to the one some of the pilots were wearing. I had my pilot's uniform in a small bag. I went into one of the airport toilets and changed into the uniform. Then I left the terminal and walked directly toward Hangar 14's nearest entrance. The guard stood with his back to me. As I came near the gate, I put the raincoat over my left shoulder, hiding the left side of my jacket, and took off my hat. When the guard turned to me, I was combing my hair with my fingers, my hat in my left hand. I didn't stop. I smiled and said, "Good evening." He made no effort to stop me, although he returned my greeting. A moment later I was inside Hangar 14. It was, really, a hangar, a huge office structure containing the offices of the chief pilot and chief stewardess, the firm's meteorology offices, and dozens of other rooms. The place had human traffic. There seemed to be dozens of pilots, a great number of stewardesses, and a lot of civilians walking around. I hesitated in the lobby. Suddenly I felt like a 16-year-old, and I was sure that anyone who looked at me would realize I was too young to be a pilot and would call the cop. I didn't turn ahead. Those who glanced at me showed no curiosity or interest. There was a large map on a wall with the names of departments and signs pointing the way. Stores department was down a corridor to my left. A tall young man with his name on the right side of his shirt stood up from a chair in front of a large desk as I stopped at the counter. Can I help ya? He asked slowly. It was the first real Southern accent I'd ever heard. I liked it. Yes, I said with a sad grin. I need a pair of wings and a hat emblem. My 2-year-old son took mine off my uniform last night, and he won't, or can't, tell me what he did with them. The storekeeper laughed. We got more wings on kids and girls than we got on pilots, I suspect, he said. We replace a lot of them, anyway. Here you are. Give me your name and employee number. He took a form from his desk and put it on the counter with a pair of golden wings and a Pan Am cap badge. Robert Black, First Officer, 35099, I said, fixing the emblem on my hat and the wings on my jacket. I'm out of Los Angeles. You need an address there? He grinned. No, damned computers need nothing except numbers, he replied, handing me a copy of the purchase form. I tried to mix with the crowd before leaving the building. I wanted to pick as much information as possible on airline pilots and airline operations, and this seemed a good opportunity. Despite the number of pilots in the building, they all seemed to be strangers to one another. I was especially interested in the plastic enclosed cards, obviously identification of some sort that most of the pilots wore on their uniform jackets. The stewardesses, I noticed, had similar ID cards but had them on their bags. Obviously, I realized as I left the building, I needed more than a uniform if I wanted to be successful in my role of Pan Am pilot. I would need an ID card and much more knowledge of Pan Am's operations than I had at the moment. I put the uniform away in my closet and started going to the public library and bookstores, studying all the material available on pilots, flying, and airlines. One small book proved especially valuable. It was the story of a veteran Pan American flight captain, with a lot of photographs, and containing airline terminology. However, I felt I must know a lot of the things that were not in the books or magazines I read. So I called the Pan Am office again. I'd like to speak to a pilot, please, I told the switchboard operator. I'm a reporter for my high school newspaper, and I'd like to do a story on pilots' lives, where they fly, how they're trained, and that sort of stuff. Do you think a pilot would talk to me? Pan Am has the nicest people. There was a captain who was happy to help. He was delighted that young people showed an interest in making a career in the airline field. I introduced myself as Bobby Black, and after some formal questions, I started to ask him the questions I wanted answered. What's the age of the youngest pilot flying for Pan Am? Well, that depends, he answered. We have some flight engineers who are probably no older than 23 or 24. Our youngest co-pilot is probably in his late 20s. Our average captain is close to 40, or in his 40s, probably. I see, I said. Well, would it be impossible for a co-pilot to be 26, or even younger? Oh, no, he answered quickly. Some of the other airlines have a lot of younger co-pilots, I've noticed. A lot depends, of course, on the type of plane he's flying and his experience. Everything is based on experience, that is, how long a pilot has been with a company. When do you hire people? I mean, at what age can a pilot go to work for an airline, say Pan Am? If I remember correctly, you can come on the payroll at 20 as a flight engineer, said the captain, who had an excellent memory. Then with 6 or 8 years' service, you could become a co-pilot? I tried to press him. It's possible, he agreed. In fact, I'd say it wouldn't be unusual at all for a capable man to become co-pilot in 6 or 8 years, even less. Are you allowed to tell me how much pilots earn? I asked. Well, again, that depends on experience, the route he flies, the number of hours he flies each week, and other factors, said the captain. I would say the maximum salary for a co-pilot would be $32,000, a captain's salary around $50,000. How many pilots does Pan Am have? I asked. The captain laughed. Son, that's a difficult question. I don't know the exact number. Probably 1,800. You can get better figures from the personnel manager. No, that's okay, I said. How many places are these pilots? You're talking about bases, he replied. We have 5 bases in the United States: San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Miami, and New York. Those are cities where our aircrews live. They report to work in that city, San Francisco, say, fly out of that city, and eventually finish a flight in that city. It might help you to know that we are not a domestic carrier, that is, we don't fly from city to city in this country. We're an international carrier, serving foreign destinations. The information helped me a lot. This may sound strange to you, Captain, and it's more curiosity than anything else, but would it be possible for me to be a co-pilot based in New York City, and you to be a co-pilot also based in New York, and we never meet? Very possible, even more so with co-pilots, for you and I would never fly together in the same plane, said the helpful captain. There are so many pilots in the system, in fact, that no one pilot would know all the others. I've been with the company 18 years, and I don't think I know more than 60 or 70 of the other pilots. The captain's words were lighting up all the lights in my little head. I've heard that pilots can fly free, I mean as a passenger, not as a pilot. Is that true? I asked. Yes, said the captain. But we're talking about 2 things now. We have a privilege to travel somewhere by air with the family. That is, if there's room, we can occupy seats, and our only cost is the tax on the tickets. We pay that. Then there's deadheading. For example, if my boss told me tonight that he wanted me in LA tomorrow to fly a trip out of there, I might fly out there on Delta, Eastern, TWA, or any other carrier that could get me there on time. I would either occupy an empty passenger seat or, more likely, ride in the jump seat, generally used by deadheading pilots. Do you have to help fly the plane? I questioned. Oh, no, he replied. I am with another company's carrier, you see. You might be offered a control seat as a courtesy, but I always refuse. We fly on each other's planes to get somewhere, not to work. He laughed. How do you go about that deadheading, I mean? I was really excited. And the captain was patient. I think he liked kids. You want to know it all, don't you? He said friendly, and continued to answer my question. It works this way. Say I want to go to Miami on Delta. I go down to Delta Operations, show them my Pan Am ID card, and I fill out a Delta form, stating my destination and giving my position with Pan Am, my employee number, and my FAA pilot's license number. I get a copy of the form and give that copy to the stewardess when I board, and that's how I get to ride in the jump seat. What's a pilot's license look like? I asked. Is it a certificate that you can hang on the wall, or like a driver's license, or what? He laughed. No, it's not a certificate you hang on the wall. It's hard to describe, really. It's about the size of a driver's license, but there's no picture. It's just a white card with black printing on it. I decided it was time to let the nice man go back to his comfortable seat. Thank you, Captain, I said. You've been really super. Glad to help you, son, he said. I hope you get those pilot's wings, if that's what you want. I already had the wings. What I needed was an ID card and an FAA pilot's license. I looked in the yellow pages under identification, picked a firm on Madison Avenue. Any ID company with a Madison Avenue address had to have class, I thought, and went to the firm dressed in a business suit. "I'd like to see one of your sales representatives, please." The sales representative had the confident appearance and manner of a man who would refuse to talk about a single ID card, so I hit him with what I thought would best get his attention and win his respect, the prospect of a big account. "My name is Frank Williams, and I represent Carib Air of Puerto Rico," I said quickly. "As you probably know, we are entering the continental United States market, and we at present have 200 people at Kennedy Airport. Right now we're using only a temporary ID card made of paper, and we want to go to a formal, laminated, plastic enclosed card with a color photograph and the company logo, similar to what the other airlines use here. We want a quality card, and I understand you people deal only in quality products." If he knew that Carib Air existed and was entering the US market, he knew more than I did. "Oh, yes, Mr. Williams. Let me show you what we have," he said enthusiastically, leading me to his office. "Now, most of the airlines we serve use this card here," he said, showing a duplicate of Pan Am's ID cards. "It has employee number, base, position, description, photograph, and, if you wish, a company logo. I think it will do perfectly." I nodded. "Yes, I think this is the card we want," I said. It was certainly the card I wanted. "Can you give me a sample?" I asked on impulse. "I'd like to show it to our top people." I studied the card. "This is fine, but it's blank," I said. "Why don't we fix this up, so they'll have an idea of what the finished product looks like? We can use me as the model." "That's an excellent suggestion," said the salesman, and led me to an ID camera that produced ID-sized photographs within minutes. He took several photographs. We selected one. He then filled out my fake name, rank, co-pilot, employee number, height, weight, coloring, age and sex, and handed it to me with his business card. "I'm sure we can do a good job for you, Mr. Williams," he said. He already had done a good job for me, except for one detail. The lovely ID card lacked Pan Am's logo and firm name. I was thinking how to solve the problem when a display in the window of a hobby shop caught my eye. There were a lot of model planes, among them a beautiful Pan Am jet with the firm's famous logo on its tail, and the company legend name, in the copyrighted lettering used by the airline, on the fuselage and wings. The model came in several sizes. I bought the smallest, for $2.49, and hurried back to my room. I threw the plain parts away. Following instructions in the kit, I put the logo and lettering in water until they separated from their base. Both the logo and the company name were of very thin plastic. I laid the Pan Am logo on the upper left-hand corner of the ID card and carefully fixed the firm legend across the top of the card. It was perfect. An exact duplicate of a Pan Am identification card. As a fake pilot, however, I was still grounded. I recalled the words of the captain I had interviewed. "Your license is the most important thing. You must have it on your person at all times. You'll be asked to show your license as often as you're asked for your ID." I considered the issue over for days, but could think of no solution. I started searching through bookstores again. I wasn't sure of what I was looking for, but I found it. There it was, a small advertisement in the back of one of the books placed by a plaque-making firm. The firm offered to duplicate any pilot's license, engraved in silver on a handsome 8x11-inch plaque, for only $35. All a pilot had to do was supply the information, including his FAA license number and ratings, and the firm would return a silver duplicate of his license, suitable for display anywhere. I wanted one of the plaques, naturally. I was excited with the idea. I didn't write the firm, I called their office. I told the salesman I wanted one of the plaques and asked if the transaction could be done by telephone. He showed no curiosity why I was in such a hurry. Well, you can give me all the necessary information over the telephone, but we'll need to have a check or money order before we actually make up the plaque. It'll be $37.50, including postage, said the man. I didn't argue. I gave him my alias, Frank Williams. I gave him my faked age and my correct weight, height, color of hair and eyes, and social security number. A pilot's license or certificate number is always a social security number. I gave myself the highest rating a pilot can reach and told him I would have a money order that same day. I had the money order in the mail within an hour, in fact. It was the only valid transaction I'd done in several weeks. The plaque arrived within a week. It was gorgeous. I took the plaque to a small print shop in Brooklyn and spoke to the head printer. Look, I'd like to get my license reduced down so I can carry it in my wallet, like you would carry a diploma. Can it be done? I asked. The printer studied the plaque with admiration. I didn't know pilots got this sort of thing when they learned to fly, he said. Well, an actual license is a certificate, but it's at my home in LA, I said. This is something my girl gave me as a gift. He reduced it to actual size, printed it, and handed it to me. The whole process took less than 30 minutes and cost me $5. I laminated it with 2 pieces of plastic myself. I'd never seen a real pilot's license, but this sure as hell looked like one. I put on my perfect pilot's uniform and caught a bus to LaGuardia Airport. I was ready for flight duty. Only if someone else flew the plane. Chapter 3. Fly a Crooked Sky. There is charm in a uniform because it marks the one who is wearing it as a person of rare skills, courage, or achievement. I felt great in my Pan Am pilot's uniform as I walked into LaGuardia Airport. Men obviously looked at me with admiration and respect. Pretty women and girls smiled at me. Airport policemen nodded courteously. Pilots and stewardesses spoke to me or lifted a hand in greeting as they passed. Every man, woman, and child who noticed me seemed warm and friendly. It was strong stuff and I loved it. In fact, I became immediately addicted. During the next 5 years, the uniform was my alter ego. Whenever I felt lonely, depressed, rejected, or doubtful of my own worth, I dressed up in my pilot's uniform and sought out a crowd. The uniform bought me respect and dignity. Without it, at times, I felt useless and dejected. I mixed with the crowd in LaGuardia's lobby that morning, taking great pride and pleasure in my crooked status. I intended to get aboard a flight to a distant city and start operating my check swindles there, but I delayed my decision. I was having too much fun enjoying the attention and respect I was receiving. I became hungry. I stepped into one of the airport's many coffee shops, dropped onto a chair at the counter, and ordered a sandwich and milk. I almost finished eating when a TWA co-pilot sat down beside me. He ordered coffee and a roll, then looked at me with mild curiosity. "What's Pan Am doing here at LaGuardia?" he asked casually. Apparently, Pan Am did not fly out of LaGuardia. "Oh, I just deadheaded in from Frisco on the first flight I could catch," I replied. "What kind of equipment you on?" he asked, eating his roll. My brains turned to ice cubes. Equipment? What did he mean, equipment? Engines? Cockpit instruments? What? I didn't remember if I had heard the word before in connection with commercial airlines. I searched for an answer, for it was obviously a normal question for him to ask. The TWA pilot was looking at me, waiting for my reply. General Electric, I said hopefully. It was obviously not the right answer. His eyes went frosty. Oh, he said, his voice lost the friendliness. He returned to his coffee and roll. I understood I wasn't prepared for deadheading, despite all my previous work and research. It was obvious that I needed a better knowledge of airline terminology, among other things. As I was leaving the terminal, I noticed a TWA stewardess carrying a heavy bag. Can I help you? I asked, reaching for the luggage. She agreed readily. Thanks, she said with a grin. That's our crew bus just outside there. Just arrived? I asked as we walked toward the bus. She grimaced. Yes, and I'm pretty tired. About half the passengers were whiskey salesmen who'd been to a convention in Scotland, and you can imagine what that scene was like. I could and laughed. What kind of equipment are you on? I asked on impulse. 707s, and I love them, she said as I lifted her suitcase aboard the bus. She paused at the bus door. Thanks much, friend. I needed your muscles. Glad I could help, I said and meant it. So equipment was an airplane, I thought, walking to my own bus. I felt a little stupid, but halfway back to Manhattan I burst out laughing as a thought came to mind. The TWA first officer was probably back in the pilot's cabin by now, telling other TWA crewmen he just met a Pan Am fool who flew washing machines. I spent the next few days in the research. In the past, I'd found my best sources of information on airlines were airlines themselves, so I started calling them. I represented myself as a college student doing a paper on transportation. Usually, I was referred to the airline's public relations department. Airline PR people love to talk about their airline. I quickly found out that my aviation education was elementary, but within a week I had passed high school and was working on my bachelor's degree. As my knowledge of airlines and airline terminology grew, my confidence returned. I opened a checking account in the name of Frank Williams, with a post office box address, and when my order for 200 personalized checks arrived, I tried cashing a few checks as an airline pilot. It was like going on safari. Cashiers couldn't get the money out of the cash registers fast enough. Most of them didn't even ask for identification. I showed my phony ID card and my fake pilot's license in their faces anyway. I didn't want my handiwork to go unnoticed. I started hanging around LaGuardia regularly, not with any intentions of catching a flight, but to meet airline personnel and to listen to airline talk. To test my vocabulary, so to say. I avoided Kennedy, because Pan Am operated out of there. I was afraid that the first Pan Am pilot I met at Kennedy would recognize me as a fraud. Some books are judged by their covers, it seems, and in my uniform I was an immediate bestseller. I walked into a coffee shop, where there usually were a dozen or more pilots or other crewmen taking a break, and someone always invited me to join him or them. I never took a drink in the bars, because I had never tried alcohol before and wasn't sure how it would affect me, but no one questioned me about this. I didn't do a lot of talking at first. I usually listened to the flow of conversations around me, monitoring the words and phrases, and within a short time I was speaking airline language like a native. LaGuardia, for me, was the language school of the air. Some of my language books were absolutely gorgeous. I guess the stewardesses didn't often see a really young pilot of their own age. Hello, one said passing, and the invitation in her voice was quite clear. I was soon dating several of the girls. I took them to dinner, to the theater, to the ballet, to the symphony, to nightclubs and to movies. Also to my place or their place. I loved them for their minds. The other parts of them were wonderful, too. But for the first time, I was more interested in a girl's knowledge of her work than in her body. I didn't object, of course, if the one came with the other. A bedroom can be an excellent classroom. I was an excellent student. Stews are good people. I have very pleasant memories of those I met. I recall one clearly. She was a Delta flight attendant whom I had met during my early studies of airline jargon. She had a car at the airport and offered to drive me back to Manhattan one afternoon. "Would you drop me at the bank there?" I asked as we walked through the lobby of the terminal. "I need to cash a check." The stewardess stopped and pointed at the dozens of airline ticket counters that lined every side of the huge lobby. There were more than 100 airlines that had ticket offices at LaGuardia. "Cash your check at one of those counters. Any one of them will take your check." "They will?" I said, surprised but trying to hide the fact. "It's a personal check and we don't operate out of here, you know." She shrugged. "It doesn't matter," she said. "You're a Pan Am pilot in uniform, and any airline here will take your personal check as a courtesy. They do that at Kennedy, don't they?" "I don't know. I've never had occasion to cash a check at a ticket counter before," I said truthfully. American's counter was the nearest. I walked over and faced a ticket clerk who wasn't busy. "Can you cash a $100 personal check for me?" I asked, checkbook in hand. "Sure, be glad to," he said, smiling. He didn't even ask me for identification. I had occasion to cash checks at airline counters very often after that. I worked LaGuardia like a fox on a turkey farm. The number of the airline counters was so large that the risk was minimal. I cashed a check at the eastern counter, for instance, then went to another section of the terminal. I was cautious. I never went back to the same counter twice. Encouraged by success and ease with which I presented myself as a pilot, I decided I was finally ready for Operation Deadhead. I'd lived in a small apartment under the name Frank Williams, and I'd paid my rent on time and in cash. The landlady thought I worked in a stationery store. None of the other residents knew me, and I'd never appeared around the building in my pilot's uniform. I had no telephone, and I'd never received mail at the address. When I packed and left the flat, there was no trail to follow. I took a bus to LaGuardia and went to Eastern's operations office. There were 3 young men working behind the counter. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" one of them asked. "I need to deadhead to Miami on your next flight, if you've got room," I said, producing my fake Pan Am ID. "We've got one going out in 15 minutes, Mr. Williams," he said. "Would you like to make that one, or wait until our afternoon flight?" The jump seats open on both flights. I didn't want to delay. "I'll take this flight," I said. "It'll give me more time on the beach." He pushed a pink form toward me. I'd never seen one before, but it was familiar because of my interview with the helpful Pan Am captain. The information needed was minimal: name, company, employee number, and position. I filled it out, gave it to him, and he handed the top copy back to me. I knew that was my boarding pass. Then he picked up the telephone and asked for the FAA tower, and my stomach was suddenly full of yellow butterflies. "This is Eastern," he said. "We've got a jump passenger on Flight 602 to Miami. Frank Williams, co-pilot, Pan Am." "Okay, thanks." He hung up the telephone and nodded toward a door outside. It was a 727. Most of the passengers had already boarded. I handed my pink form to the stewardess at the door to the aircraft, and turned toward the cockpit like I'd been doing this for years. "Hi, I'm Frank Williams," I said to the three men inside. They were busy with what I later learned was the takeoff equipment, and ignored me except for nods of greeting. I looked around the cabin and the butterflies started flying again. I didn't see a jump seat, whatever a jump seat looked like. There were only 3 seats in the cockpit, and all of them were occupied. Then the flight engineer looked up and grinned. "Oh, sorry," he said, closing the cabin door. "Have a seat." As the door closed, I saw a small seat attached to the floor. I sat down into the small seat, feeling the need for a cigarette. And I didn't smoke. "How long have you been with Pan Am?" asked the captain, and I was aware from his tone that he was just making conversation. "This is my 8th year," I said, and wished immediately I'd said 6. None of the 3 showed any surprise, however. It apparently was a position compatible with my rank. "What kind of equipment are you on?" asked the co-pilot. 707s, I said. Although I felt like I was sitting on a bed of hot coals all the way to Miami, it was really very easy. The conversation was indifferent and mostly among the 3 Eastern officers. At one point the co-pilot, who was handling traffic, handed me a pair of earphones and asked if I wanted to listen in, but I refused, saying I preferred a rock station. That brought a laugh. I followed their talk, monitoring the slang phrases that passed among them and noting how they used the airline jargon. I thanked the flying officers before leaving. They casually wished me luck and the captain said the jump seat was generally available. Anytime you need it. I'd never been to Miami before. I was impressed and excited by the colorful tropical palms around the terminal, the warm sun and the bright, clean air. I was inside the terminal before I realized I didn't have the slightest idea where Pan Am housed its people in Miami. Well, there was an easy way to find out. I walked up to the Pan Am ticket counter and the girl behind the counter, who was busy with passengers, stepped over to face me. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at me curiously. "Yes," I said. "This is my first delay in Miami. I'm here on a replacement status. I normally don't fly trips in here, and I came in such a hurry that no one told me where the hell we stay here." "Where do we stay over here?" "Oh, yes, sir, we stay at the Skyway Motel if it's going to be less than 24 hours, she answered. "Well, it's only a short distance," she said. "You can wait on the crew bus or you can just take a cab over there." "Are you going to take a cab?" "I think so," I replied. I knew I was going to take a cab. I didn't want to get on a bus full of real Pan Am flight people. "Wait a minute then," she said and stepped over to her station. She opened a drawer and took out a card and handed it to me. "Just give that to any of the cab drivers. Have a good stay." Damned if it wasn't a ticket for a free cab ride, good with any Miami cab firm. Airline people lived in the land of milk and honey, I thought as I walked out of the terminal. I liked milk and I knew I was in the right place when I checked in at the motel. I registered under my phony name and put down General Delivery, New York, as my address. The registration clerk took the card, glanced at it, then stamped "Airline Crew" in red ink across its face. "I'll be checking out in the morning," I said. She nodded. "All right. You can sign this now if you want, and you won't have to stop by here in the morning." "I'll just sign it in the morning," I replied. I didn't see any Pan Am crewmen around the motel. In my room, I changed into casual clothes and called the Eastern stewardess at the number she'd given me. She picked me up in her friend's car and we had a ball in the Miami beach night spots. I didn't put any moves on her. I was so excited about the success of my first adventure as a phony pilot that I forgot about it. By the time I remembered, she'd gone home. I checked out at 5:30 the next morning. "Can I get a check cashed?" I asked as I signed the check. "Sure, do you have your ID card?" he said. I handed it to him and wrote out a check for $100, payable to the hotel. He copied the fictitious employee number from my fake ID card onto the back of the check and handed me back my ID and five $20 bills. I took a cab to the airport and an hour later deadhead to Dallas. I wasn't aware that Pan Am didn't fly out of Dallas. I was aware that deadheading pilots were always on business. "What the hell are you going to Dallas for?" the co-pilot asked in casually curious tones. I was searching for a reply when he gave me the answer. "You are on a charter or something?" "Yeah, freight," I said, knowing Pan Am had freight service all over the world, and the subject was dropped. I stayed overnight at a motel used by flight crews of several airlines, cheated the restaurant with a $100 hot check when I left in the morning, and deadhead to San Francisco immediately. It was a usual pattern I followed, with variations for the next 2 years. Modus operandi, the cops call it. My modus operandi was a ready-made fraud, one for which the airlines, motels, and hotels set themselves up. The hotels and motels around cities or international airports considered it just good business, of course, when they set up agreements with as many airlines as possible to house flight crews. I know from numerous conversations on the subject that the flight crews liked the plan. The deadheading arrangement between airlines everywhere in the world was also a system based on good business practices. It was more than a courtesy. It provided a maximum of mobility for pilots and co-pilots needed in emergency or other situations. However, airport security was minimal at that time. Terrorist raids on terminals and plane hijackings didn't yet become the trend. Airports in small cities had a low crime rate, with theft a common problem. No one, apparently except extreme situations, ever checked out the pilot's bona fides. The form consisted of an original and 2 copies. I was given the original as a boarding pass, and I gave that to the stewardess who was responsible for boarding. I knew the operations clerk always called the FAA tower to inform the tower operators that such and such flight would have a jump passenger aboard, but I didn't know that a copy of the pink pass was given the FAA. Apparently, the 3rd copy was kept in the operations files of the airline. An airline official who made a statement to police concerning my tricks offered what seemed to him a logical explanation. "You simply don't expect a man in a pilot's uniform, with proper credentials and obvious knowledge of jump procedures, to be an imposter, damn it." But I have always suspected that the majority of the jump forms I filled out ended up in the wastebaskets, original and both copies. There were other factors, too, that gave big chances in my favor. I was not at first a big operator. I limited the checks I cashed at motels, hotels, and airline counters to $100. It always took several days for one of my worthless checks to go to New York, and by the time the check was returned stamped insufficient funds, I was a long time gone. The fact that I had a legitimate account helped my success also. The bank didn't return my checks with the notice, "worthless," "fraudulent," or "forgery." They simply sent them back marked, "insufficient funds to cover." So it's not too amazing that I could operate so freely when you consider the last 2 factors. The National Crime Information Center did not exist as a police tool during the period. If I had to compete with the computerized police system, with its huge bank of criminal facts and figures, my career would probably be a lot shorter. And lastly, I was pioneering a fraud that was so unbelievable, so seemingly impossible that it worked. In the last months of my adventures, I met a captain with whom I had deadheaded a couple of times. It was a tense moment for me, but he relaxed it with the warmth of his greeting. Then he laughed and said, "You know, Frank, I was talking to a Delta stewardess a couple of months ago, and she said you were a phony. I told her that was crap, that you'd handled the controls of my bird. What did you do to that girl, boy? Threw her out of bed?" My adventures. The first few years, that's exactly what they were for me, adventures. Adventures in crime, of course, but still adventures. I kept a notebook, a secret journal in which I wrote down phrases, technical data, names, dates, places, telephone numbers, thoughts, and a collection of other data I thought was necessary or might prove helpful. It was a little black book, textbook, diary, and airline Bible, and the longer I operated, the thicker it became. Little things mean a lot to a big phony. The names of every flight crew I met, the type of equipment they flew, their route, their airline, and their base went into the book as some of the more useful data. For example, I'm deadheading on a national flight. "Where you guys out of?" "Oh, we're Miami-based." A secret look into my notebook then. "Hey, how's Red doing?" "One of you has to know Red O'Day." "How is that Irishman?" All three knew Red O'Day. "Hey, you know Red?" "Yeah, I've deadheaded a couple of times with Red. He's a great guy." Such exchanges made my image as a pilot stronger and usually stopped the mild cross-examinations, which I had to pass at first. Just by watching and listening, I became an expert in other things that improved my impersonations. I had to improvise a lot. Whenever I deadhead into a city not used by Pan Am, such as Dallas, and didn't know which motels or hotels were used by airline crews, I simply walked up to the nearest airline ticket counter. "Listen, I'm here to work a charter that's coming in tomorrow." "Where do the airlines stay around here?" I asked. At intervals, I holed up in a city for 2 or 3 weeks for logistics purposes. I usually opened an account in, say, a San Diego bank or a Houston bank, giving the address of an apartment I had rented for the occasion, and when my little box of personalized checks arrived, I packed up and went to the airways again. I knew I was a hunted man, but I was never sure how closely I was followed those first 2 years. Any traveling con man occasionally feels panic, thinking he's going to be arrested, and I was no exception. Whenever I got this fear, I tried to go to Earth like a fox. Or with a fox. Some of the girls I dated thought I was marriage material. I had a regular invitation from several to visit them in their homes for a few days and get to know their parents. When I felt the need to hide out, I dropped in on the nearest one and stayed for a few days or a week, resting and relaxing. I got on well with the parents in every case. None of them ever found out they were helping and assisting a juvenile criminal. When I felt the situation was cool again, I took off, promising the girl that I'd return soon and we'd talk about our future. I never went back, of course. I was afraid of marriage. Besides, my mother would not have permitted it. I was only 17. Chapter 4. If I'm a kid doctor, where's my jar of lollipops? National Flight 106, New Orleans to Miami. A routine deadheading deception. I had grown confident in my cockpit jump seats. After 200 illegal flights, I occupied a jump seat with the confidence of a Wall Street broker in his seat on the stock exchange. I even felt a little nostalgic as I stepped into the flight cabin of the plane. My first fraudulent flight had been on a national carrier to Miami. Now, 2 years later, I was returning to Miami, and again on a national jet. I thought it a good sign. "Hi, Frank Williams. Nice of you to give me a lift," I said and shook hands with the cabin crew, Captain Tom Wright, Aircraft Commander 40s, First Officer Gary Evans, early 30s, and Flight Engineer Bob Hart, late 20s. Nice guys. All three officers had headsets, and none of the three had offered me a set for monitoring. If you weren't offered, you didn't ask. The cockpit of a passenger plane is like the captain's bridge on a ship. Protocol is strictly observed. The conversation between the three in the tower was short and careless, rather uninteresting, in fact, as most such one-sided exchanges are. Suddenly it became really interesting, so interesting that I started to worry. Wright and Evans exchanged surprised looks, and Hart was suddenly looking at me with strange expression. Then Wright turned around to face me. "Do you have your Pan AM identification card?" he asked. Yeah, I said and handed it to him, feeling uneasy as Wright studied the artistic fake. "This is National 106 back to tower. Yes, I have an ID card here." "Pan AM, looks fine." "Employee number?" 35099. Yeah? Just a moment." He turned again to me. "Do you have your FAA license?" "Yes, of course," I said, trying to look puzzled and keep myself under control. Wright examined the forgery closely. He was the first real pilot to inspect the illegal license. He handed back my ID card and the license. His face reflected a mixture of disappointment and apology. "I don't know what that was all about." He shrugged and did not ask me if I had any ideas on the subject. I did, but I didn't like any of them. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that the tower operator in New Orleans was just too formal, or doing something he thought he should be doing. He was the first tower operator who observed the FAA regulation in my experiences. It was obviously an unusual incident for Tom Wright, too. The three officers seemed to forget the matter. They asked the usual questions and I gave the usual answers, but I was very nervous all the way to Miami. Wright had just landed in Miami when the unpleasant one-sided conversation started again while the plane was going to the dock. "Yeah, we can do that." No problem, no problem," Wright said in answer to some question from the tower. "Take the controls, I'll be right back," he said to Evans, getting out of his seat and leaving the flight cabin. I was sure then that I was in trouble. There was no doubt in my mind that I was the subject of the conversation. I was not surprised at all when the jet door opened and two uniformed Dade County Sheriff's officers stepped aboard. One took up a position blocking the exit of the passengers. The other entered into the flight cabin. "Frank Williams?" he asked, his eyes passing from man to man. "I'm Frank Williams," I said, getting out of the jump seat. "Mr. Williams, would you please come with us?" he said. His tone was courteous. "Certainly," I said. "But what's this all about anyway?" It was a question that also interested the three flight officers and the stewardesses. All of them had curious expressions. None of them asked any questions, however, and the officers did not satisfy their curiosity. "Just follow me, please," he instructed me, and went out the exit door. His partner was behind me. They didn't put handcuffs on me. They didn't touch me or give the impression that I was under arrest. But I had no illusions. It was my complete failure. The officers escorted me to their patrol car. "Will you get in, please, Mr. Williams? We have instructions to take you to the sheriff's office." The officers said nothing to me during the ride. I remained silent myself, showing puzzled indignation. The officers were clearly uncomfortable, as if they weren't really sure of their role. I was taken to a small room. One of the officers sat at the desk while the other stood in front of the closed door. None of the men made an effort to search me, and both were very polite. The one behind the desk spoke nervously. Mr. Williams, there are some questions as to whether you work for Pan AM or not, he said, more in explanation than accusation. What? I exclaimed. That's crazy. Here's my ID and here's my FAA license. Now you tell me who I work for. I threw the phony documents down on the desk, acting as if I were accused of selling nuclear secrets to the Russians. He examined the ID card and the pilot's license with obvious embarrassment and passed them to the second officer, who looked at them and handed them back with a nervous smile. They both gave the impression they'd just arrested the president for jaywalking. Well, sir, this really isn't our deal. The people who asked us to do this will come soon, the one behind the desk said. Okay, I agreed. But who are these people? He didn't have to tell me, I knew. And he didn't tell me. One of them left for a short time, returning with coffee, milk, and sandwiches, which they shared with me. There was little conversation at first. Oddly enough, I became relaxed and confident as time passed. I told a couple of airline jokes and they started to relax too and asked me questions about my experiences as a pilot and the types of planes I flew. One of the officers was a private pilot himself, and at the end of 30 minutes he looked at his partner and said, You know, Bill, I think someone's made a mistake here. It was almost midnight when this someone arrived. He was in his late 20s, wearing an Ivy League suit and a serious expression. Mr. Williams? FBI. Will you come with me, please? I thought we were going to the FBI offices, but instead he led me to the next office and shut the door. Mr. Williams, I was called over here by the Dade County authorities, who were contacted by the federal agency. We really don't know what the problem is, but apparently there's some question as to whether you work for Pan Am. The problem is, the employee records are in New York and the Pan Am offices are closed over the weekend. He paused and grimaced. Like the policeman, he wasn't sure he was doing right. I work for Pan Am, as you will learn when the offices open Monday morning, I said in an indignant tone. Now, what do you do? Put me in jail. If you intend to do that, I have a right to call a lawyer. And I intend. He stopped me with a raised hand. Look, Mr. Williams, I know what the situation is, if you're a real pilot, and I have no reason to believe you are not. Listen, do you have any local colleagues we can contact? I shook my head. No, I'm based in LA. I just deadhead in here to see a girl, and I was going to deadhead back on Monday. I know a lot of pilots here, but they're with other airlines. I know several stewardesses, too, but again they're with other carriers. He inspected the 2 documents and returned them with a nod. Tell you what, Mr. Williams, he offered. Why don't you give me the names of a couple of pilots you know here, and the names of some of the stewardesses, too, who can confirm your status? I took out my book of facts and names and gave him the names and telephone numbers of several pilots and stewardesses, hoping some of them were home and remembered me as an actual pilot. I spent an uneasy 45 minutes in the room alone, and then the agent came back. He was smiling. Mr. Williams, you're free to go. I have confirmation from several persons as to your status, and I apologize for the inconvenience and embarrassment. I'm really sorry, sir. A Dade County Sheriff's officer was behind him. I want to add our apologies too, Mr. Williams. It wasn't our fault. I'm just sorry as hell about it, sir. I reached out my hands in a peace gesture and smiled. Hey, don't worry about it. I understand, and I'm glad you guys are doing your job. We appreciate you were so nice about it, Mr. Williams, said the policeman. Oh, your bag is over there by my desk. Obviously, it wasn't searched. There was more than $7,000 in currency at the bottom of my bag, among my underwear. I gotta go, gentlemen, I said, shaking hands with each of them. I've got a girl waiting, and if she doesn't believe this story, I may be calling one of you. The FBI agent grinned and handed me his card. Call me, he said. Especially if she has a beautiful friend. Outside, I caught a cab and asked the driver to take me to the bus station. I went into the bus station restroom and changed my uniform, took another cab and went straight to the airport. The earliest flight leaving Miami was a Delta flight to Atlanta. I bought a one-way ticket and paid cash for it. But I totally relaxed only when I boarded the plane. There was a girl in Atlanta, an Eastern stewardess. In any city, there was always a girl. I told this one I was on a 6-month holiday. I thought I'd spend a couple months in Atlanta, I said. I'm transferred to New Orleans in 30 days. But you stay here until then, she said. It was a very pleasant and relaxing month, at the end of which I rented a truck and moved her to New Orleans. She wanted me to stay with her there, but I didn't feel comfortable in New Orleans. My instincts told me to get the hell away from it, so I went back to Atlanta, where I felt hidden and safe. One of its advertisements in the Atlanta Journal caught my eye. It presented River Bend, located near Atlanta, a spa-like center of apartments with a golf club, an Olympic-sized pool, saunas, tennis courts, a gym, and game rooms. I don't smoke. I've never had a wish to try tobacco. I didn't drink at that time. I didn't have any troubles with alcohol or its users. My one fault was women. The River Bend ad showed it as a fascinating place to live. I could see it crowded with girls, most of them young, leggy, lovely. I immediately decided that I wanted to be a bull in this garden. River Bend was both expensive and selective. I was given a large application to fill out when I told the manager I wanted to rent a one-bedroom apartment for 1 year. The form demanded more information than a prospective mother-in-law. I decided to stay Frank W. Williams because all my phony identification was in that name. I paused at the space for occupation. I wanted to put down airline pilot, for I knew that the uniform would attract girls. On impulse, nothing more, I put down medical doctor as my occupation. I left the space for relatives empty and said I'd like to pay 6 months' rent in advance. I put $20 for $100 bills on top of the application. The assistant manager who accepted the application, a woman, was curious. "You're a doctor?" she asked. "What type of doctor are you?" I thought I'd better be the kind of doctor that would never be needed around River Bend. "I'm a pediatrician," I lied. "However, I'm not practicing right now. My practice is in California, and I've taken a leave of absence for 1 year to work on some research projects and to make some investments. I moved in the same day. The one-bedroom apartment wasn't too large, but there was enough room for the action I had in mind. Life at River Bend was fascinating, delightful, and satisfying. There was a party in someone's place almost every night. I was usually invited to be a part of the scene, whatever it was. The other residents accepted me quickly and made no effort to find out details about my personal life or affairs. They called me Doc, and of course, there were those who didn't know the difference between doctors. One guy had a complaint about his foot. The other had pains in his stomach. The brunette who had a tight feeling around her upper chest. "I'm a pediatrician, a baby doctor." "You want a podiatrist, a foot doctor," I told the first man. "I'm not licensed to practice in Georgia." "I suggest you talk to your own doctor." I told the other one. I examined the brunette. Her brow was too small. However, one Saturday afternoon I felt a sudden wind that quickly grew into a tragicomic storm. I answered a knock on my door to face a tall man in his middle 50s, casually dressed but still looking perfect. He had a smile on his pleasant face and a drink in his hand. "Dr. Williams?" he said, and thinking he was correct, spoke to the point. "I'm Dr. Willis Granger, Chief Resident Pediatrician of Smithers Pediatric Institute and General Hospital in Marietta." I was too astonished to reply, and he went on with a grin. "I'm your new neighbor. Just moved in yesterday. The assistant manager told me you were a pediatrician." I couldn't help but come up and introduce myself to a colleague. "I'm not interrupting anything, am I?" No, not at all, Dr. Granger." "Come in," I said, hoping he would refuse. He didn't. He walked in and settled on my sofa. "Where did you go to school here?" he asked. It was a normal question for doctors' meeting, I suppose. I knew only one college that had a school of medicine. "Columbia University in New York," I said, hoping he wasn't its graduate. He nodded. "A great school. Where did you serve your internship?" Internship. That was done in a hospital, I knew. I'd never been in a hospital. I'd passed a lot of them, but the name of only one stuck in my mind. I hoped it was the kind of hospital that had interns. "Harbor Children's Hospital in Los Angeles," I said and waited. "Hey, terrific," he said, and then dropped a personal line to my relief. "You know, Smithers is a new hospital. I've just been appointed to head up the pediatric staff. It'll be a 7-story hospital when it's finished, but we've got only 6 floors open at the moment, and not too much traffic as yet. Why don't you come up and have lunch with me some afternoon and let me show you around the place? You'll like it, I think." "That sounds great, I'd love it," I replied, and soon he left. I was suddenly depressed after his visit, and my first impulse was to pack and get the hell out of River Bend, if not Atlanta. If I stayed, it would be only a matter of time before he would know I was a phony, and I doubted he'd let it go at that. He'd probably report to the authorities. I was tired of running. I'd been on the run for 2 years, and at the moment I didn't recall the excitement, glamour, and fun of it all. I just wanted a place to call home, a place where I could be at peace for a while, a place where I had some friends. River Bend had been that place for 2 months, and I didn't want to leave. I was happy at River Bend. A sudden anger replaced my depression. To hell with Granger. I wouldn't let him force me back to the fraud scheme. I'd just avoid him. If he came to visit, I'd be busy. When he was in, I'd be out. It wasn't easy. Granger was a pleasant and friendly man. He started showing up at the parties to which I was invited. If he wasn't invited, he would invite himself. And he was soon one of the most popular men in the community. I couldn't avoid him. I started to relax around Granger. In fact, I started to look for his enjoyable company. He preferred talking about lovely women he met at River Bend and the fun he was having with them. Or he talked politics, world affairs, cars, sports, ethics, and anything else. I knew, however, that the subject of pediatrics would appear sooner or later, so I started spending a lot of time in the Atlanta library, reading books by pediatricians, medical journals with articles on children's medicine. I quickly obtained a general knowledge of pediatrics, enough knowledge, I felt, to deal with any casual professional conversations. I felt informed enough, after several weeks of study, in fact, to accept Granger's invitation to have lunch with him at the hospital. He met me in the lobby and introduced me to the receptionist. A similar introduction was made during the tour around the hospital. We visited every department. I met the hospital administrator, the chief radiologist, the head of physical therapy, the head nurse, interns, other doctors, and dozens of nurses. We had lunch in the hospital cafeteria, and from the number of doctors and nurses who joined us, it was obvious Dr. Granger was a popular and well-liked man. I returned to the hospital often, mostly because of Brenda Strom, a nurse I had met there and started dating, but also because the hospital had a large medical library with the latest books, journals, and medical magazines dealing with pediatrics. Most of the doctors think you're pretty sharp, because you try to maintain your professional competence even though you're on a leave of absence, Brenda told me. I think you're pretty sharp, too. She was 30, a sexy brunette with a power for making love. I sometimes wondered what she might think if she knew her lover was an 18-year-old fraud. However, I never thought of myself as a teenager anymore, except for rare occasions. When I looked in a mirror, I saw a mature man of 25 or 30, and that's how I felt about myself, too. I had been just an adventurous boy when I changed my chronological age, but my mental clock, during the past 2 years, had changed, too. After several visits to the hospital, my fears disappeared. I began to enjoy my role as a doctor. I felt the same pleasures, the same ego encouragement I'd known as a fake pilot. I had no problems at all until one afternoon, after lunch with Granger and Brenda. I was leaving the hospital when John Coulter, the administrator, stopped me. "Dr. Williams!" "May I see you just a moment, sir?" Without waiting for an answer, he went to his office. I followed him. "Doctor, have a seat, please," said Coulter. I relaxed immediately. He was still addressing me as "Doctor," and his manner was polite. Coulter, in fact, seemed embarrassed. "Dr. Williams, I'm going to ask you for a very big favor, a favor I have no right to ask," Coulter said with a grimace. "I think you're the man who can solve my problem. Will you help me?" I looked at him, puzzled. "Well, I'll be happy to if I can, sir," I replied cautiously. Coulter nodded and his tone became energetic. "Here's my problem, doctor. On my night shift, I have a resident doctor who supervises 7 interns and about 40 nurses. He had a death in the family this afternoon, a sister in California. He's left and will be gone about 10 days. Doctor, I've got nobody to cover that shift. Nobody. I can't find a doctor to replace him, and I can't do it myself. I'm not a medical doctor, as you know." His voice became pleading. "Dr. Williams, could you come up here and just sit around for 10 days from midnight to 8? You won't have to do anything, I assure you. Just be here, so I can satisfy the state's requirements. I need you, doctor. We'll pay you well, doctor. As a bonus, I'll even put Nurse Strong on the shift for the 10 days. If you refuse me, I don't know what the hell I can do." The request astonished me, and I objected quickly. "Mr. Coulter, I'd like to help you, but there's no way I could agree," I protested. "Oh, why not?" Coulter asked. "Well, in the first place, I don't have a license to practice medicine in Georgia," I began, but Coulter interrupted me with a shake of his head. "Well, you wouldn't really be doing anything," said Coulter. "I'm not asking that you actually treat patients. As for a license, you don't really need one. You have a California license, and California standards are as high as Georgia standards, and recognized by our medical association. What do you say?" Reason told me to refuse. There were too many dangers involved. But I was challenged. Well, if there's not that much difficulty involved, and if it won't take a lot of my time, I'll be happy to help you out, I agreed. Now, specifically, what would be my duties? Coulter laughed. He was obviously relieved and happy. Your duty? Just be here, doctor. Walk around. Show yourself. Play poker with the interns. Hell, Frank, I'm gonna call you Frank because you're a friend of mine. Now do anything you want to do. Just be here. My first shift set the tone for all my next duty tours. I was aware from the moment I accepted Coulter's request that there was only one way I could carry out my bluff. If I was going to fake out 7 interns, 40 nurses, and dozens of hospital personnel, I had to give the impression that I was something of a clown of the medical profession. I decided to project the image of a happy, easygoing, always joking guy who didn't care whether the rules learned in medical school were kept or not. I started to show that image the minute I arrived for duty the first night and was met by Brenda. She was smiling. She took me to the 6th floor of the hospital. It included the nursery, with about a dozen newborn babies, and 3 wings for children recovering from illness, injury, or surgery, or children for diagnosis or treatment. There were about 20 children, from 2 to 12 months, in my charge. Fortunately, they weren't technically under my care. My role was strictly a supervisor's or observer's role, although I was expected to be the medical doctor available for any emergencies. I hoped there wouldn't be any emergencies, but I had a plan for such an occasion. I spent the first night observing the interns. All of them wanted to be pediatricians, and the 6th floor was an excellent place to practice. They seemed to me, after several hours of watching them, to be as competent and capable as some of the staff doctors. The first shift was lazy and pleasant until about 7 a.m., when the nurse in charge of the 6th floor contacted me. Doctor, don't forget before you go off duty that you need to write charts for me, she said. Oh, yeah, okay, get them ready for me, I said. I went up and looked over the charts ready for me. There was one for each patient, noting medication given, times, the names of the nurses and interns involved, and instructions from the doctor. That's your space, said the nurse, pointing to a blank area on the chart. I noticed the other doctors involved had written in Latin. Or Greek. Or maybe it was just their normal handwriting. I sure couldn't read it. I didn't want anyone to read what I wrote either. So I wrote some hieroglyphics all over each chart and signed my name in the same manner in each space. Here you are, Miss Murphy, I said, handing back the charts. You'll note I gave you an A. She laughed. I got a lot of laughs during the following shifts for my funny remarks. But I knew I was on thin ice, and about 2:30 a.m. at the end of my first week, the ice started cracking. Dr. Williams! To emergency, please. Dr. Williams! To emergency, please. I had avoided the emergency ward before, and it was my arrangement with Coulter that I wouldn't have to handle emergency cases. I hate the sight of blood. I can't stand the sight of blood. Even a little blood makes me sick. I once passed near the emergency ward and saw them bringing in an accident victim. He was all bloody and weeping, and I hurried to the nearest toilet and vomited. Now here I was in the emergency room. I used the toilet first. Then I used the stairs instead of the elevator. I knew my delay might be harmful to the one who needed a doctor, but it would be just as harmful if I rushed to the emergency ward. I didn't know what to do once I got there, especially if the patient was bleeding. This one wasn't, fortunately. It was a kid of about 13, with white face, lying on the table and looking at the 3 interns around him. The interns looked at me as I stopped inside the door. Well, what do we have here? I asked. A simple fracture of the tibia, about 5 inches below the patella. It looks like that, said the senior intern, Dr. Hollis Carter. We were just getting ready to take some x-rays. Unless we find something more serious, I will put him in a walking cast and send him home. I looked at Carl Farnsworth and Sam Bice, the other two interns. Dr. Farnsworth? He nodded. I agree, doctor. It may not even be broken. How about you, Dr. Bice? I think that's all we've got here, he said. Well, gentlemen, you don't seem to have much need of me. Carry on, I said and left. I had other emergency ward calls, and each time I let the interns handle the situation. I usually went in, asked one of them about the nature of the illness or injury, and then asked him how he would treat the patient. Then I addressed the other interns who were usually present. If he or they agreed, I nodded and said, All right, doctor. Carry on. I didn't know what the interns thought about such incidents, but I soon found out. They loved it. They think you're great, Frank, said Brenda. Young Dr. Carter especially thinks you're terrific. I heard him telling his friends how you let him get real practice, that you just come in, get his comments on the situation, and let him carry on. He says you make him feel like a practicing doctor. I smiled. I'm just lazy, I replied. But I realized after the first shift that I needed some help. I hid a pocket dictionary of medical terms in one of the empty closets on the unfinished 7th floor, and when I heard the interns or nurses mention a word or phrase, the meaning of which I didn't know, I went upstairs and looked up the word or words. Sometimes I spent 15 or 20 minutes in the closet just looking through the dictionary. On my last night shift, Coulter found me. Frank, I know I've got no right to ask this, but I have to. Our doctor isn't coming back. He has decided to stay and practice in California. Now, I'm pretty sure I can find a replacement within a couple of weeks. So could I ask you to stay that long? He waited, a pleading look on his face. He caught me at the right time. I was in love with my role as doctor. I was enjoying it almost as much as my role of airline pilot. And it was much more relaxing. I didn't write bad checks because the hospital was paying me a $125 a day. Consultant, salary, payable weekly. Sure, John, I agreed. Why not? I've got nothing else to do at the moment. I was confident I could carry the fraud scheme for another 2 weeks, and I did, but then the 2 weeks became a month and the month became 2 months, and Coulter still hadn't found a replacement. I maintained my informal, to hell with rules and regulations manner with the interns, nurses, and others under my nominal command, and the night shift staff continued to support me loyally. The interns were proud to be on my shift. The young doctors respected me. They thought I was crazy, but competent. You don't treat us like the other staff doctors, Dr. Williams, Carter said. When they come while we're treating a patient, they say move aside. You don't. You let us go ahead and handle the case. You let us be real doctors. I sure as hell did. I didn't know a damn thing about medicine. Those young doctors didn't know it until years later, but they were the only reason I was able to keep on my medical show. Fortunately, I was never faced with a life or death situation, but there were risky occasions where only my clown's mask saved me. Early one morning, for example, one nurse called for me. Dr. Williams, we just delivered a baby, and Dr. Martin was called across the hall to do a cesarean section. He asks if you'd be kind enough to make a routine examination of the child. I couldn't refuse. I was chatting with 2 nurses on my shift at the time the request was made. I'll help you, Dr. Williams, volunteered one of them, Nurse Stern, who was attending medical school herself and hoped to be a pediatrician specializing in newborns. It was a baby boy, still red and wet from his passage through the narrow channel of life. He looked at me with a sad expression. "Okay, kid, take a deep breath," I commanded in a military tone, starting to apply my stethoscope to the baby's chest. Nurse Stern grabbed my arm, laughing. "Doctor, you can't use that stethoscope on a newborn. You use a pediatric stethoscope." She returned with a smaller version of the one I held. I didn't know they came in sizes. "Will you stop fooling around, please? We've got a lot of work to do." I stepped back and waved at the baby. "Tell you what, Dr. Stern." You examined the boy. "I'd like to check your style." She couldn't resist the temptation. "Well, I can do it," she said, as if I'd insulted her, but still obviously pleased. She took the stethoscope and started to manipulate the baby's arms, legs and hips, looked into his eyes, ears, mouth and anus, and ran her hands over his head and body. She stepped back and looked at me with a challenge. "Well?" On the forehead. "Thank you, doctor, you've saved my only son," I said in a sentimental tone. The baby lost his sad look. No one is really certain if newborn infants have thoughts or are aware of what is going on around them. No one except me. That kid knew I was a phony. I could see it in his face. I examined several newborns after that. I never knew what I was doing, of course, but thanks to Nurse Stern, I knew how to do it. But I still spent a lot of time in my 7th-floor linen closet. There were times, I'm sure, when my practical jokes irritated people. Like the night, in the 11th month of my impersonation, when a nurse ran to the room where I was writing my hieroglyphic comments on charts. "Dr. Williams, we've got a blue baby in 608. Come quickly." Oddly enough, in the 11 months of my experience as a doctor, I'd never heard the term blue baby. "I'll be right there," I said, "but first I've got to check the green baby in 609. When I made no move, she rushed off, shouting for one of the interns. I consulted my medical dictionary. I learned a blue baby was one suffering from lack of oxygen in the blood, usually caused by a heart defect. I took off for room 608 and was relieved to find one of my interns there. He was fixing a portable oxygen tent around the infant. "I've called his doctor. He's on his way. I'll handle it until he gets here, if it's all right with you, sir." It was all right with me. The incident shook me. I realized I was playing a role that had reached its limits. I suddenly knew some child could die as a result of my impersonation. I was determined to speak to Coulter and resign. "Well, Frank, you can go back to being a playboy," he said cheerfully. "We've got a new doctor. Got him from New York. He'll be here tomorrow." I was relieved. I came to the hospital the next day to pick up my final paycheck and wasn't at all disappointed when I didn't meet my replacement. I was leaving the hospital when I encountered Jason, the elderly janitor on the night shift. "You're coming to work a little early, aren't you, Jason?" I asked. "Working a double shift today, doctor," said Jason. "You know, Jason, I won't be around anymore," I said. "They finally found a replacement." "Yes, sir, I heard," said Jason. He looked confused. "Doctor, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Jason." "Anything. I liked him. He was a nice old man." He took a deep breath. "Doctor, you never knew it, but I always spent my relaxing time up there on the 7th floor." And doctor, for nearly a year now I saw you go in a linen closet up there. You never went in with anything, and you never came out with anything. I know you don't drink, and doctor, there is nothing in that closet, nothing. I searched it a dozen times. Doctor, my curiosity will drive me to drink. Just what did you do in that linen closet, doctor? I won't tell anybody, I swear. I laughed and hugged him. Jason, I was contemplating my navel in that closet. That's all. I swear it. But I know he never believed me. He's probably still inspecting that closet. Chapter 5. A law degree is just an illegal technicality. A week after I left the hospital, I decided to leave Atlanta. There was no obvious reason for me to go, at least I felt none, but I thought it unwise to stay. The fox who keeps to one place is the easiest catch for the hounds, and I felt I had stayed too long in one place. I knew I was still hunted, and I didn't want to make it easy for the hounds. I later learned that my decision to leave Atlanta was a clever one. About the same time, in Washington, D.C., FBI Inspector Sean O'Reilly was ordered to drop all his other cases and concentrate on me. O'Reilly was a tall, strict man with the appearance of an Irish bishop and the determination of a hound, an extremely efficient agent dedicated to his job. I admired O'Reilly, even when I made every effort to destroy his mission and to embarrass him professionally. If O'Reilly has any personal feelings to me, I am sure hostility is not among such emotions. O'Reilly is a very honest man in all respects. Of course, I had no knowledge of O'Reilly's existence at the time I left Atlanta. I decided to hole up for a month or so in the capital city of another southern state. As usual, the reason for my choice was the fact that I knew an airline stewardess there. I didn't have a more delightful influence on my actions than a lovely woman then. Her name was Diane, and I had known her for about a year, and she knew me under the alias Robert F. Conrad, a Pan Am first officer. I was forced to maintain the nom de plume with her, because we developed a close and pleasant relationship, during which, at first, she had gone into details of my personal background, including my educational history. Most pilots have a college degree, but not all of them majored in the aviation sciences. I told Diane that I had taken a law degree but had never practiced, because a career as an airline pilot had seemed not only more exciting but also much more profitable than law. She readily accepted the idea that a man might prefer the cockpit to the courtroom. A few days after my arrival in her city, she took me to a party arranged by one of her friends, and there introduced me to a pleasant fellow named Jason Wilcox. You two must get along. Jason is one of our assistant state's attorneys. Diane told me. She turned to Wilcox. And Bob here is a lawyer who never practiced. He became a pilot instead. Wilcox was immediately interested. Hey, where did you go to law school? Harvard, I said. If I was going to have a law degree, I thought, I might have one from the best university. But you never practiced? He asked. No, I said. I got my commercial pilot's license the same week I took my master's in law, and Pan Am offered me a job as a flight engineer. A pilot makes $30,000 to $40,000, and I loved flying. Maybe someday I'll go back to law, but right now I fly only 80 hours a month. Not many practicing lawyers have it that good. How did you do at Harvard? He asked. I felt he was leading up to something. Pretty well, I guess, I replied. I graduated with a 3.8 average. Why? Well, the Attorney General is looking for lawyers for his staff, Wilcox replied. Why don't you take the bar here and join us? I'll recommend you. The job doesn't pay an airline pilot's salary, of course, but it pays better than unemployment. And you'll get some law practice, which sure as hell couldn't hurt you. I almost refused immediately. But the more I thought about it, the more it intrigued me. The challenge again. I shrugged. What would it mean for me to take the bar examination in this state? I asked. Not much, really, said Wilcox. Just take a transcript from Harvard to the state bar examiner's office and apply to take the bar. They won't refuse you. Of course, you'd have to know our civil and criminal laws, but I've got all the books you may need. Since you're from another state, you'll be allowed 3 attempts at the bar here. You shouldn't have any trouble. A transcript from Harvard. That might be difficult, I thought, since the university and I were strangers. But then I'd never had any pilot's training either. And I had a valid FAA pilot's license in my pocket stating I was qualified to fly passenger jets, didn't I? My instincts began to drive me. I wrote to the Harvard Law School and asked for a fall schedule and a law school catalog, and within a few days the requested material was delivered in my mailbox. The catalog presented a list of all the courses necessary for a Doctor of Law from Harvard, and it also had some lovely logos and letterheads. But I still didn't have the idea of what a college transcript looked like. Diane was an Ohio University graduate who had majored in business administration. I casually started a conversation about her student years. You didn't do much studying, I said, joking. Oh, yes, I did, she objected. I had a 3.8 average. You can have fun and still make good grades, you know. Oh, come on. I don't believe you had that average grades. I need to see your transcript to believe that, I protested. She grinned. Well, I just have one, she said, and returned from her bedroom a few minutes later with the document. The transcript consisted of 4 legal-sized sheets of lined paper and was, in fact, a certified photocopy of her 4 years of college work. The first page had the name of the university in large, bold letters. Then came her name, the year she had graduated, the degree she had received, and the college awarding the degree. Other pages were filled, line by line, with the courses she had taken, the dates, and her grades. I put the structure of the transcript to memory before handing it back. Okay, you're not only sexy, you're also clever, I apologized. I went shopping the next day at a graphic arts store, a stationery store, and an office supply firm and bought everything I needed to produce a document, including some legal-sized bond paper, some letters in several different types, some artist's pens and pencils, a knife, some glue, a right-angle ruler, and some gold seals. I started by simply cutting out the Harvard Law School logo and sticking it at the top of a bond paper. I then attached the school seal, also taken from the catalog. Next, I filled in my name, year of graduation, degree, and then, using the right angle and a fine artist's pen, I carefully lined several pages. I didn't know whether it looked like an actual Harvard transcript. The test would come when I presented the phony document to the state bar examiner's office. I spent 3 weeks reading the books in Wilcox's office library, finding law a much easier, but duller subject than I had thought, and then presented myself at the state bar examiner's office. A law student acting as a clerk made a copy of the phony document and handed my original counterfeit back to me. While I was filling out the form, he looked through a calendar and called someone on the telephone. You can take the exam next Wednesday, if you think you're ready, he said, and then grinned, trying to encourage me. It should be very easy for a Harvard graduate. I failed. To my astonishment, however, the notice that I had failed was attached to the test I had taken, which reflected the answers I had correctly given and the questions I had missed. Someone in the examiner's office obviously liked me. I went back to Wilcox's library and concentrated on the sections of the test I had missed. Wilcox himself acted as a teacher for me. After 6 weeks, I felt I was ready to attempt the test a second time. I failed again. But again, my test papers were returned to me, showing where I had made mistakes. In fact, I was delighted at the number of correct answers, and I was determined to pass the examination on my final try. I took the third examination 7 weeks later and passed. Within 2 weeks, I received a handsome certificate stating the fact that I could take the state bar and was licensed to practice law. I burst into laughter. I hadn't even finished high school and had never been to a college campus, but I was a certified lawyer. However, I considered my actual lack of academic qualifications simply a technicality, and in my 4 months of legal practice, I learned the law is full of technicalities. Technicalities are what destroy justice. Wilcox kept his promise. He arranged a job interview for me with the state attorney general, who, on Wilcox's recommendation, hired me as an assistant. My salary was $12,800 annually. The senior assistant was Philip Rigby, from an old and established local family. Rigby considered himself a Southern aristocrat, and I was an example of his strongest negative stereotypes. I was a Yankee, but even worse, I was a Catholic Yankee. He gave me the role of go for coffee, go for this or that book, go for anything he could think of. I was the highest paid delivery boy in the state. I was popular with the young bachelors in the division. I still had over $20,000 in my illegal account, and I spent it freely on the friends, inviting them to dinners in fine restaurants, riverboat trips, and evenings in expensive nightclubs. I intended to give the impression that I was from a rich New York family. I lived in a luxurious apartment overlooking a lake, drove a leased Jaguar, and collected a wardrobe worthy of a British duke. I wore a different suit to work each day of the week, partly because it pleased me, but mostly because my rich wardrobe seemed to irritate Rigby. If my wardrobe filled Rigby with indignation, it was approved by others. One day in court, during a short delay in the case, the judge leaned forward on his bench and addressed me. "Mr. Conrad, you may not give much to legal expertise to the case in this court, but you certainly add style, sir. You are the best-dressed lawyer, and the court praises you." It was a true reward, and I was pleased, but Rigby nearly had an apoplectic seizure. Actually, I was satisfied with my delivery boy role. I had no real desire to try a case. There was too much danger that my basic lack of knowledge of the law would be discovered. Basically, my position was an ideal hiding place, which was hard to be detected by the hounds. When you're looking for a criminal, you don't often think to look for him on the Attorney General's staff, especially if you're seeking a teenage high school dropout. Several weeks after I joined the court staff, Diane was transferred to Dallas. I was sad at losing her only for a very short time. I was soon dating Gloria, the daughter of a high state official. Gloria was a member of a Methodist family, and I often accompanied her to church. It was a gesture of respect on my part that was appreciated by her parents, and actually I enjoyed it. In fact, I developed a close friendship with the young pastor of the church, and he persuaded me to become involved in the church's youth programs. I participated actively in building several children's playgrounds in poor areas of the city, and took part in several committees carrying out other youth projects. It was a strange time for a con man, but I had no real sense of hypocrisy. For the first time in my life, I was giving unselfishly, with no thought of any return, and it made me feel good. There was a real Harvard graduate in one of the committees. Not just a Harvard graduate, but a Harvard Law graduate, and he was delighted to meet me. He was practically crazy with joy and rushed on me immediately. When had I graduated? Who had my instructors been? Who were the girls I knew? To what club had I belonged? What pubs had I gone to? Who had my friends been? I successfully ignored him at first, pretending to concentrate on the committee business. But he sought me out at every opportunity. He called me to have lunch. He dropped by my office. He called me to invite me to parties, to play golf, or to take part in some cultural event. And always he started talking about Harvard. What buildings had I had classes in? Didn't I know Professor so-and-so? I couldn't avoid him, and of course, I couldn't answer many of his questions. He got suspicions and began to build a residential jesty case against me as a phony Harvard man, if not a phony lawyer. It became residential judicature for me when I learned he was making numerous requests into my background, seriously questioning my honesty. I understood I had to disappear. I had pretended to be a doctor for almost a year. I had played the role of lawyer for 9 months. While I was leading my life during those 20 months, I hadn't passed any bad checks or done anything else to attract the attention of the authorities. My escape from my Harvard colleague turned into something of a vacation. I traveled around the western states for several weeks, touring Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Wyoming, Nevada, Idaho, and Montana, delaying wherever the scenery intrigued me. Since the scenery usually included some very lovely women, I always stayed intrigued. Although the image of myself as a criminal started to disappear, I had no hopes for justification. In fact, looking to the future, I stopped long enough in large cities to equip myself with dual identities as a fictitious airline pilot. Using the same procedures that had enabled me to assume the alias of Frank Williams, a first officer for Pan Am, I created Frank Adams, a co-pilot for Trans World Airways, complete with uniform, fake ID, and FAA pilot's license. I also produced a set of false documents that would allow me, as Frank Williams, to be a pilot for either Pan Am or TWA. Soon I was in Utah, a state famous for its college campuses. I had a couple of college degrees, and so I thought it would be only fair if I at least look at a real university campus, and I visited several Utah colleges. There were so many lovely girls on one campus that I was tempted to become a student. Instead, I became a teacher. While I was sitting in my motel room one afternoon, reading the local newspaper, my attention was attracted to the news about a lack of summer instructors at one university. The faculty dean, Dr. Amos Grimes, was very concerned about finding summer replacements for the school's 2 sociology professors. A vision of myself in a classroom with a dozen beauties took my imagination, and I couldn't resist. I rang up Dr. Grimes. "Dr. Grimes, Frank Adams here," I said. "I have a doctor's degree in sociology at University in New York. I'm on holiday here, and I see by the newspaper that you're looking for sociology instructors." "Yes, we're certainly interested in finding some people," Dr. Grimes replied cautiously. "Of course, you understand it would be only a temporary position, just for the summer. I assume you have some teaching experience?" "Oh, yes," I said. "But it was several years ago." "Let me explain my position, Dr. Grimes. I am a pilot for Trans World Airways, and I am on a 6-month holiday for medical purposes. I'm looking around for something to do, and when I saw the story in the newspaper, it occurred to me that it might be pleasant to get back into a classroom again. I was a professor of sociology at City College of New York for 2 years before I joined TWA. "Well, it certainly sounds like you're a likely candidate for one of our positions, Dr. Adams," said Dr. Grimes, now enthusiastic. "Why don't you come by my office tomorrow morning and we'll talk about it?" "I'd be delighted to do that, Dr. Grimes," I replied. "Since I'm a complete stranger in Utah, could you tell me what documents I will need to apply for a faculty position with your college?" "Oh, just a transcript from Columbia will do, really," said Dr. Grimes. Of course, if you can get a couple of letters of recommendation, it would be desirable. No problem, I said. I'll have to send for both my transcript and the letters of recommendation, of course. I came here unprepared, since I didn't even think of a temporary teaching position until I saw the story. I understand, Dr. Adams, replied Dr. Grimes. I'll see you in the morning. I wrote Columbia University that afternoon, requesting a complete catalog and other brochures on the school. My meeting with Dean Grimes was a very pleasant one. He seemed immediately impressed with me. Dr. Grimes, like many men with permanent jobs, had a romantic view of airline pilots. I had more than enough anecdotes to satisfy his abstract interest. I have no doubt at all that we can use you this summer, Dr. Adams, he said on my departure. I'm personally looking forward to your being here on campus. The materials I had requested from Columbia University arrived within the week, and I drove to buy the supplies necessary for my current counterfeiting venture. My finished transcript was a beauty, giving me a 3.7 grade average and presenting my doctoral dissertation on the sociological influence of aviation on the rural populations of North America. Then I sat down and wrote myself 2 letters of recommendation, one from the university office and one from the head of the sociology department. I was cautious with both letters. They simply stated that I had been a sociology instructor during the years 1961 to 62 and that the faculty committee had given me very satisfactory marks. Dr. Grimes only glanced at the documents when I presented them to him. He introduced me to Dr. Wilbur Vanderhoff, assistant head of the sociology department, who also didn't examine the documents carefully before sending them on to faculty personnel for filing. I was hired within the hour to teach 2 6-week semesters during the summer at a salary of $1,600 per semester. I was assigned to teach a 90-minute freshman course in the morning, 3 days a week, and a 90-minute sophomore course in the afternoon, twice weekly. Dr. Vanderhoff provided me with the 2 textbooks. Any other supplies you might need, you can probably find in the bookstore, said Dr. Vanderhoff. He grinned. I'm glad to see you're young and strong. Our summer sociology classes are usually large ones, and you'll earn your salary. I had 3 weeks before the first summer semester started. I pretended I wanted to refresh myself, so I audited several of Dr. Vanderhoff's classes, just to get an idea of how a college course was given. At night I studied the 2 textbooks, which I found both interesting and informative. Vanderhoff was right. Both my classes were large ones. There were 78 students in my freshman class and 63 students in my sophomore course. The majority in both classes were girls. That summer was one of the most enjoyable of my life. I enjoyed my role as a teacher very much. So did my students, I'm certain. My courses were taught by the book, as required, and I had no difficulty there. I just read 1 chapter ahead of the students and selected what parts of the text I wanted to speak about in details. But almost every lecture I went far from the textbook in both classes, speaking on crime, the problems of young teenagers from broken families, and the influences on society as a whole. My departures from textbook, which were taken from my own experiences, unknown to the students, always led to hot discussions and debates. At weekends I relaxed by visiting one or the other of Utah's wonderlands, usually accompanied by an equally wonderful companion. The summer was gone very quickly, and I felt real regret when it ended. Dr. Vanderhoff and Dr. Grimes were delighted with my work. "Keep in touch with us, Frank," said Dr. Grimes. "If ever we have a permanent position for a sociology professor, we'd like a chance to tempt you down from the skies," said Dr. Grimes. At least 50 of my students sought me out to tell me how much they had enjoyed my classes and to wish me goodbye and good luck. I didn't want to leave that Utah utopia, but I could find no valid reason for staying. If I stayed, my past was certain to catch me up, and I did not want these people's image of me to be destroyed. I traveled west to California. There was a storm in the Sierras when I crossed the mountains, but it was nothing compared to the tornado of crime I soon created myself. Chapter 6. Swindle is also a technicality. The former police chief of Houston once said of me, Frank Abagnale could write a check on toilet paper, covered by the Confederate States Treasury, sign it you are hooked and cash it at any bank in town, using a Hong Kong driver's license for identification. There are several bank employees in Eureka, a small town in California, who would confirm that statement. Eureka, for me, was my start as an expert forger. I was already an advanced student of check swindling when I arrived, of course, but I took my master's degree in forgery in California. I didn't intend to make Eureka a stage in my criminal career. It was only a pit stop on my way to San Francisco, but the girl appeared and I stayed for a few days. I knew I needed to leave the country because I felt that FBI agents, sheriffs, and detectives were hard on my heels. There was no obvious reason for such fears. I hadn't fooled anyone with a bad check in 2 years, and co-pilot Frank Williams had been in the closet for the same period. I should be feeling reasonably safe, but I wasn't. I was nervous and doubtful, and I saw a cop in every man who gave me more than a casual glance. But my bad feelings calmed down because of the girl and Eureka after a couple of days. One absolutely fascinating feature of Eureka, to me, was its banks. It had more money houses for a city its size than any large city I'd ever visited. And I needed money, a lot of it, if I was going to be an emigrant swindler. I still had several packs of worthless personal checks. But it occurred to me that the personal check fraud wasn't really that great. It was the easiest fraud, but too risky from too many points, and the criminal punishment for passing a phony $100 check was the same as that for $5,000. I felt I needed a better type of check. Like a payroll check, say. Like a Pan Am payroll check, naturally. No one would ever be able to say I wasn't a loyal thief. I went shopping. I obtained a book of blank counterchecks from a stationery store. Such checks, still in wide use at the time, were ideal for my purposes because the payer had to fill in all the details, including the respondent bank's name. I then rented an IBM electric typewriter with several different printing types. I located a hobby shop that handled models of Pan Am's jets and bought several kits in the smaller sizes. I made a final stop at an art store and bought magnetic tape numerals and letters. Thus supplied, I returned to my motel room and started to work. I took one of the blank counter checks and across the top fixed the Pan Am emblem from one of the kits. Below I typed in the airline's New York address. In the upper left-hand corner of the check I applied the Pan Am logo, and in the opposite right-hand corner I typed in the words, expense check. I made myself, Frank Williams, the payee, of course, in the amount of $568.70, a sum that seemed reasonable to me. In the lower left-hand corner I typed in Manhattan Bank and the bank's address. Below the bank name, across the bottom left-hand corner of the check, I laid down a series of numbers with magnetic tape. Such numbers are very important to anyone cashing a check and much more important to a hot check swindler. A good swindler is operating a numbers game, and if he doesn't know the right ones, he's going to end up with an absolutely different set of numbers across the front and back of a state-issued jail shirt. The manufacturing of the check was hard work, requiring more than 2 hours, and I was not at all happy with the finished product. I looked at it and decided it was not a check I would cash if I were a teller and someone presented the check for payment. So I invented an expensive fur cover for the rabbit fur check. I took one of the windowed envelopes, supplied it with a Pan Am logo and Pan Am's New York address, stuck a blank piece of paper inside, and mailed it to myself at my motel. The letter was delivered the following morning, and the local post office had assisted me in my scheme. The clerk who had stamped the envelope did such a perfect job with the postmark that it was impossible to tell where the letter was mailed from. I was delighted with the man's carelessness. I put on my Pan Am pilot's uniform, placed the check in the envelope, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I drove to the nearest bank, walked in, and presented myself to the teller, a young woman. "Hi," I said, smiling. "My name is Frank Williams, and I'm on holiday here for a few days before reporting to Los Angeles. Would you please cash this check for me? I think I have sufficient identification." I took the envelope from my inside pocket, pulled the check, and laid it on the counter, along with my phony Pan Am ID card and my FAA pilot's license. I dropped the envelope, with its Pan Am logo and return address, on the counter. The girl looked at my fake identification documents and glanced at the check, but she seemed more interested in me. Commercial airline pilots in uniform were obviously a rare person in Eureka. She pushed the check back to me for signing, and while she counted out the money, she asked chatty questions about my work and the places I'd been. I was careful to take the envelope with me when I left. I was certain that she noticed the envelope with its symbols, and it had clearly raised her trust in the check. The transaction also confirmed a suspicion I had. It's not how good a check looks, but how good the person behind the check looks that influences tellers and cashiers. I went back to my motel room and produced more hot checks, all in the amount of $500, and the following day I successfully passed all of them in different banks. Based on my knowledge of the check-outing procedures used by banks, I calculated I could spend 2 more days in Eureka before the first one was returned as a counterfeit. But an identity crisis, which I experienced periodically, forced me to change my timetable. I never took my assumed identity completely, and I never forgot I was really Frank Abagnale, Jr. In fact, in casual situations with people, where I felt no need to play a role, I always presented myself as Frank Abagnale, an independent fellow from the Bronx. It was no different in Eureka. Away from my motel, where I was registered as Frank Williams, I was simply Frank Abagnale, Jr. Up to a point, my actual identity became a refuge from the pressures and risks of impersonation. In Eureka, I met a fisherman in a seafood restaurant. He stopped at my table to tell me he had personally caught the fish I was eating, and then sat down to chat with me. He was a car fan, and I told him about my old Ford and what I had done to dress up the car. "Hey, that's what I'm trying to fix up now, a 1950 Ford convertible," he said. "You don't have any pictures of your car, do you?" I shook my head. "I do, but they're all back in my room at home," I said. "Give me your address in New York and I'll send you some pictures of my wheels when I'm finished with it," he said. "I might even drive to New York and see you there." It was very unlikely that he would either write me or come to New York to see me, and also unlikely that I would be there to receive his letter, so I searched my pockets for a piece of paper. I took one of the blank counter checks. I borrowed a pencil from a waiter and was writing my name and New York address on the back of the check when the fisherman was called to the telephone. He talked for a few minutes and then waved at me. "Hey, listen, Frank, I gotta go back to the boat," he shouted. "Come tomorrow, will you?" He left before I could reply. I gave the pencil back to the waiter and asked for my bill. "You need a better pencil," I said, pointing at what I had written on the back of the counter check. The words could be hardly read. I put the check back in my pocket instead of tearing it up, an action that was both foolish and fortunate. Back in my room, I dropped it on top of the open book of counter checks, changed clothes, and called the girl. We spent a pleasant evening at a Thai restaurant. It was such a pleasant evening that I was still recalling it early the next morning when I sat down to create 3 more phony Pan Am checks. There were only 3 banks left in and around Eureka that didn't have one of my artistic frauds, and I didn't want to miss any of the 3. I was charmed with my new scheme. All my fears of cops behind me were forgotten. I had also completely forgotten the young fisherman of the past afternoon. Finished with the checks, I put them into the now well-used envelope. By mid-afternoon, I was back in my motel room with $1,500. That night, I told the girl I was leaving the following day. "I'll probably be flying out of LA," I lied. "So I'll be back often." She believed me and suggested we go down to eat seafood. But in the middle of the meal, I looked out the window, saw a fishing boat coming to the dock, and remembered the young fisherman. I also remembered I had put down my real name and my New York address, my father's address, on the back of one of the counter checks. What the hell had I done with that check? I couldn't recall. Back in my room, I searched for the blank check but couldn't find it. I had to conclude that I'd used that blank check as a Pan Am expense check and had passed it at one of the 3 banks. I sat down on the bed and forced myself to recall the events that had resulted in the situation. I had dropped the check on top of the open book of counter checks. I had picked it up first the next morning when I produced the 3 counterfeit expense checks. And I had placed it in the phony envelope, so it had been the first of the 3 cashed. And I now recalled the teller who'd cashed the check for me. I'd given her lots of attention. Too much, it seemed. I suddenly felt hot. I started thinking again of leaving the country, jumping the border into Mexico. Or even more warm climate. But this time I contemplated the idea reluctantly. In Eureka, I'd invented what I considered a great new theft scheme, one that really paid back in a crap game. I had intended to work my counterfeit check scheme from coast to coast and border to border. But did I have to give up the game? Had I blown my cover at this point? If I hadn't noticed the words on the back of the check, maybe no one else had either. There was also a good possibility the check was still in the bank. If it hadn't left the bank, perhaps I could get it back. I was sure I could invent a good story if the check was still in the bank. I packed and paid my motel bill before calling the bank the next morning. I asked for the head teller and was connected with a woman who identified herself as Stella Waring. "Mrs. Waring, a Pan Am pilot cashed a check in your bank yesterday," I said. "Can you tell me?" She interrupted me before I could say more. "Yes, a fraud check," she said with indignation and without asking my identity or my reason for calling. "We've informed the FBI. They're sending an agent for the check." I wasn't challenged. I acted on impulse. I had to protect my real identity. "Yes," I said. "This is the FBI. I wanted to tell you that our agent will be there in about 15 minutes. Do you have the check, or is there someone else he should contact?" "Just tell him to see me, sir. I'll have the check," Mrs. Waring replied. "Of course, we'd like a copy of the check for our records." "That is all right, isn't it?" "Of course," I assured her. "I will instruct Mr. Davis to provide you with a copy." I was at the bank within 5 minutes, dressed in a blue business suit. "Mrs. Waring, I'm Bill Davis of the FBI." "I believe my boss called you earlier?" I said. She nodded with a grimace. "Oh, yes, Mr. Davis," she said. "I have the check right here." She did not ask for credentials or seem suspicious of my status at all. She simply handed the check to me. I examined it in a professional manner, since I was the manufacturer. On the back was my real name and my father's address. "Have you made a copy of this yet?" I asked. "No, but there's a copying machine right there in the corner. It'll only take me a minute," she said. "I'll do it," I said, and walked quickly to the machine before she could object. I copied only the front of the check, a factor she didn't notice on her desk. "Let me sign this and date it," I said, picking up a pen. "This copy is your receipt. You understand we need this original as evidence. It will be in the custody of the U.S. Attorney. I think this is all we need at the moment, Mrs. Waring. We certainly appreciate your cooperation." I pocketed the damned original and left. I learned later that I left the bank only 5 minutes before the actual FBI agent arrived. I also learned later that Mrs. Waring herself was more than a little upset when she learned she was fooled, but FBI agents have a certain romantic image of their own, and a woman doesn't have to be young to be impressed by a glamorous figure. Pretending to be an FBI agent was not the smartest move I made at that point in my criminal career. Federal agents are generally highly efficient officers, but they are even more efficient and determined when someone impersonates an FBI agent. I had delayed for a while the disclosure that Frank Williams, pilot imposter, was in reality Frank Abagnale, Jr., but I gave O'Reilly a fresh trail to follow, and after that time it was hound and hare to the end. However, I was still in a learning stage as a forger, an advanced student, and I tended to take risks which an experienced check swindler would try to avoid. I was an independent actor, writing, producing, and directing my own scripts. I did not know any professional criminals, and I didn't seek out criminal expertise. The people who assisted me in my fraudulent schemes were all honest, respectable people whom I forced to help me. In reality, my total autonomy was the biggest factor in my success. The usual criminal sources of information for the police were useless to them in their search for me. When my true identity was established, the trails collected by police were all after-the-fact trails. I was always several days gone by the time the crime was detected, and officers were never able to pick up my trail until I struck again, usually in some far-off city. Once I started producing fraudulent checks, I realized I had reached a point of no return. I had chosen fraud as a profession, my means of surviving. That's why I decided to perfect my working skills. I studied check transactions and banking procedures as hard as any investor studies the markets. I went to libraries and read banking magazines, journals, and trade books. I studied financial publications and created opportunities to talk with bank officials. All my illegal techniques, in short, were polished with legal wax. Of course, as someone once observed, there is no right way to do something wrong, but the most successful check swindlers have 3 factors in their favor, and any one of the 3, or the combination of the 3, can pay back. The first is personality, and I look on personal appearance as part of one's personality. Top con artists are well dressed and have an air of confidence and authority. They're usually as charming, courteous, and seemingly sincere as a politician seeking re-election. The second is observation. Observation is a skill that can be developed, but I was born with the ability to pick up details and facts the average man ignores. Observation, as I will illustrate later, is the only necessary requirement for successful innovative con scheme. The third factor is research, the big difference between the ordinary criminal and the super con man. A criminal planning a bank robbery might succeed, but in the end he depends on his gun. A con artist's only weapon is his brain. I knew as much about checks as any teller employed in any bank in the world, and more than the majority. I'm not even sure many bankers had the knowledge I had of checks. Here are some examples of the things I knew about checks and most tellers didn't, little things that enabled me to trick them. I said earlier that the good check swindler is really operating a numbers game, and he is. All checks, whether personal or business, have a series of numbers in the lower left-hand corners, just above the bottoms. Take a personal check that has the numbers 1130-119-546-085 across the bottom left-hand corner. During my career as a swindler champion, not 1 out of 100 tellers or private cashiers paid any attention to such numerals, and I'm convinced that only a few people handling checks knew what the series of numbers meant. I'll decode it. The number 11 denotes that the check was printed within the 11th Federal Reserve District. There are 12 and only 12 Federal Reserve districts in the United States. The 11th includes Texas, where this check was printed. The 3 after the 11 tells one that the check was printed in Houston specifically. The 0 denotes that immediate credit is available on the check. In the middle series of numbers, the 0 identifies the bank, Houston, and the 119 is the bank's identification number within the district. The 546-085 is the account number assigned to the customer by the bank. How does that knowledge help a check swindler? For example, such a man presents a payroll check to a teller or cashier for payment. It is a fine-looking check, issued by a large Houston firm, payable at a Houston bank, or so it states on the face of the check. The series of numbers in the lower left-hand corner, however, starts with the number 12, but the teller or cashier doesn't notice that, or if she or he does, she or he doesn't know the meaning of the numbers. A computer knows. When the check goes to the bank, usually the same night, a computer rejects it, because while the check says it's payable in Houston, the numbers say it's payable in San Francisco and bank computers read only numbers. The check, therefore, is sent to the 12th district, San Francisco in this case. In San Francisco, another computer rejects the check because the bank identification number doesn't match, and at that point the check goes to a bank clerk. Usually, the clerk looks only at the face of the check, sees that it is payable at a Houston bank and mails it back, thinking its arrival in San Francisco a computer mistake. In any event, 5 to 7 days have passed before the person who cashed the check is aware he or she has been swindled, and the swindler has already gone. I became rich because of the ignorance of bank personnel concerning their own numerical codes and the cashier's lack of knowledge of checks. In San Francisco, where I stayed for several weeks after leaving Eureka, I manufactured several dozen of the phony Pan Am expense checks and passed them in San Francisco banks, at the airport, and in banks or hotels in surrounding communities. My envelope was still an invaluable help in cashing the fake checks, but I used it so much that it started to come apart. I needed a new one. And why not a real one? I thought. San Francisco was one of Pan Am's bases, and I was a Pan Am pilot, wasn't I? Hell no, I wasn't, but who would know that? I went to the airport and walked into the Pan Am operations complex. Say, where can I get some writing paper and envelopes? I'm a stranger here. I asked the first person I encountered, a radio operator. The stockroom, around the corner there, he said, pointing. Help yourself. I did. Since there was nobody in the stockroom, I grabbed a pack of envelopes and other stationery with Pan Am's letterhead. One day I returned after a regular raid on money houses to find there was no space in my suitcase and bag. They were both full of bills. I was stealing faster than I could spend. I took $25,000, went to a bank, rented a safe deposit box under the name of John Calcane, paid 3 years' rent in advance, and put the cash in the box. The next day I went to another bank and repeated the procedure, using the name Peter Morelli. Then I went back to San Francisco and fell in love. Her name was Rosalie, and she was a stewardess for American Airlines. Rosalie was one of the loveliest women I'd ever met, and I still think so. She had frosted blonde hair and, as I learned quickly, something of a frosted nature. As a companion, Rosalie was delightful. We shared an enjoyment of music, good books, the ocean, skiing, the theater, travel, and other pleasures. Rosalie was very religious, and like me a Catholic, but she did not insist that I attend church with her. "Why don't you speak to me about my sins?" I asked her in a joking tone one day. She laughed. "I don't know that you have any, Frank," she replied. "You sure don't have any bad habits that I'm aware of. I like you as you are." I found myself getting closer to Rosalie each time I was with her. She had so many good qualities. She seemed a woman most young bachelors dream of finding for a wife. She was loyal, neat, intelligent, balanced, helpful, lovely, and she didn't smoke or drink. "Rosalie, I love you," I said to her one night. She nodded. "I love you too, Frank," she said quietly. "Why don't we go to my parents and tell them about us?" Her parents were nice people. They welcomed me warmly, and when Rosalie told them we were going to be married, they were enthusiastic and congratulated us warmly. For 2 days all I heard was wedding plans, although I hadn't actually asked Rosalie to marry me. But it seemed taken for granted that I had, and her parents obviously approved of me. But how could I marry her? She thought I was Frank Williams, a Pan Am co-pilot with a bright future. I knew I couldn't maintain the image if we were married. It would be only a matter of time before she learned I was really Frank Abagnale, a teenage swindler with a phony front and a dirty past. I couldn't do that to Rosalie, I told myself. What started as a pleasant visit turned into a terrible and painful experience for me. I felt I really loved Rosalie, and I felt I really wanted to marry her, but I didn't see how. However, Rosalie thought she was going to marry me, and her parents thought she was going to marry me. They happily set the date, made up a list of guests, planned the reception. I took part in the discussions, outwardly happy, but inwardly totally miserable because of guilt and shame. One afternoon, Rosalie and I went bike riding. We were sitting under a huge tree in a park, and Rosalie, as usual, was chattering about our future, where we'd live, how many kids we'd have, and so on. I looked at her as she talked, and suddenly I felt she'd understand, that she loved me enough to not only understand but to forgive. One of the features I loved most in her was her compassion. I put my hand over her mouth. "Rosalie," I said, and I was surprised at my calmness. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to try and understand. If I didn't love you so much, I wouldn't tell you this at all, for I've never told anyone what I'm going to tell you. And I'm telling you, Rosalie, because I love you and I want us to get married. Rosalie, I am not a pilot for Pan American. I'm not 28, Rosalie. I'm 19. My name is not Frank Williams. My name is Frank Abagnale. I'm a crook, Rosalie, an imposter and a check swindler, and I'm hunted by the police all over the country." She looked at me, shocked. "Are you serious?" she finally said. "But I met you at the airport." "You have a pilot's license." "I've seen it." "You have a Pan Am ID card." "You were in uniform, Frank." "Why are you saying these things, Frank? What is the matter with you?" She laughed nervously. "You're kidding me, Frank." I shook my head. "No, Rosalie, I'm not. Everything I've said is true." And I told her everything. I talked for an hour, watching her face. Her eyes expressed horror, disbelief, agony, hopelessness, and pity, and then were full of tears. She was weeping uncontrollably. Then she took my handkerchief, dried her eyes and face, and stood up. "Let's go back home, Frank," she said quietly. "You go on, Rosalie," I said. I need to be alone for a while. And Rosalie, don't say anything to anyone until I get there. When your parents learn about this, I want them to hear it from me. Promise me that, Rosalie." She nodded. "I promise, Frank. I'll see you later." She left, a lovely woman reduced to a lonely figure at the moment. I got on my bike and rode around, thinking. I really didn't know what she was thinking, or what her reaction would be when I appeared at her home. Should I even go back? All I had at her house were some sports clothes, a couple of suits, underwear, and shaving kit. I'd left my uniform in my motel room in San Francisco, and I had my fake ID and phony pilot's license in my pocket. I arrived at her home from a side street, and just before reaching the corner I stopped and walked along a neighbor's garden. There was an LA black and white cop car parked in front of Rosalie's home. A uniformed policeman in the car was watching the street. My lovely Rosalie had reported on me. I went back to the bike and rode off in the opposite direction. When I reached the downtown district, I parked the bike and caught a cab to the Los Angeles airport. Within 30 minutes I was in the air, returning to San Francisco. I was bothered with a feeling I couldn't identify. The unclear emotion stayed with me as I packed, paid my motel bill, and returned to the airport. I bought a ticket to Las Vegas, using the name James Franklin. I still had the odd feeling during the flight to Las Vegas. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't guilt. I couldn't understand it until I stepped off the plane in Nevada. Then I identified the emotion. It was relief. I was happy to have Rosalie out of my life. The knowledge astonished me, for not 6 hours ago I'd looked for a way to make her my wife. Astonished or not, I was still relieved. It was my first trip to Las Vegas, and the city was everything and more than I'd imagined. There was a crazy, electric atmosphere about the whole city, and the people, visitors and residents, seemed to be rushing around in a state of crazy excitement. New York was slow and calm compared to it. "Gambling fever," explained a cab driver when I mentioned the dynamic atmosphere. "Everybody's got it. The only winners in this town are the casinos. Everybody else is a loser. Take my advice if you're gonna play the girls. A lot of them are hungry." I followed his advice and played the chicks. He was right about the girls. Most of them were hungry. Actually hungry. Famished, in fact. However, as the Bible says, "He that giveth unto the poor shall not lack." I was feeding a famished girl. She lived on casino-free lunches for 3 days while trying to contact a brother in Phoenix to ask for money on bus. "I blew everything," she said while eating a huge steak. "All the money I brought with me, all the money in my checking account, all I could raise on my jewelry. I even cashed in my return airline ticket. It's a good thing my room was paid in advance." She grinned cheerfully. "Serves me right. I've never gambled before, and I didn't intend to gamble when I came here. But the damn place gets to you." She looked at me with a doubt. "I hope you're just acting nice, buying me dinner." "I know there are ways a girl can get things, but that it's not my style, man." I laughed. "Relax. I like your style. Are you going back to a job in Phoenix?" She nodded. "I am. But I may lose a job if I'm not back by Monday." "What do you do?" I asked. She looked the secretary type. "I'm a check designer for a firm that designs and prints checks," she said. "A commercial artist, really. It's a small firm, but we work for a lot of big banks and business firms." I was astonished. Well, I'll be damned. That's interesting. What do you do when you design and print a check? Oh, it depends on whether we're making up ordinary checks or special ones. You know, the kind with pictures, landscapes, and different colors. Anybody could do it, really, with a little training. Her name was Pixie. I leaned over and kissed her on the forehead. Pixie, how would you like to go home tonight by air? I asked. You're kidding me? She couldn't believe. No, I'm not, I assured her. I'm an airline pilot for Pan Am. We don't fly out of here, but I have deadhead privileges. I can get you a seat to Phoenix on any airline that serves Vegas from there. All it'll cost is a little white lie. I'll say you're my sister, okay? Hey, all right, she said delightedly and gave me a big hug. While she packed, I bought her a ticket, paying for it in cash. I took her to the airport and pressed a $100 bill in her hand as she boarded the plane. No arguments, I said. That's a loan. I'll be around to collect one of these days. I got to Phoenix, but I made no effort to contact her. If I had, it should be not to collect money but to pay back, because Pixie let me into the mint. The next day I sought out a stationery printing supply firm. I'm thinking of starting a little stationery store and job printing shop, I told the salesman. I iron out Vegas like a bed sheet. I visited nearly 100 casinos, bars, hotels, motels, nightclubs, and other gambling spots. No cashiers showed the slightest hesitation about cashing one of my phony checks. Would you cash this and give me $50 in chips? I asked, and he handed me $50 in chips and the balance in cash. I usually stayed in a for 30 minutes, playing the tables, before going to the next place, and much to my fun I hit the casinos that way, too. I won $300 playing the slot machines. I won $1,600 playing blackjack. Without the slightest idea of the game, I picked up $900 playing roulette, and I won $2,100 at the dice tables. In all, I hit Vegas for $39,000. I left Nevada driving a rented Cadillac. I had it for nearly 3 months. I made a tour of the Northwest and Midwest, maintaining the role of an airline pilot on vacation. Since I didn't want to leave the hounds a trail that could be too easily followed, I didn't exactly throw my counterfeits like confetti, but I stopped to cash them now and then. I picked up $5,000 in Salt Lake City, $2,000 in Billings, $4,000 in Cheyenne, and I conned Kansas City banks for $18,000 before ending up in Chicago, where I simply parked the Cadillac and walked away. I decided to hole up in Chicago for a while and give some serious thought to the future, or at least to the place where I wanted to spend the future. I was again thinking of leaving the country. I wasn't too worried about my current security, but I knew that if I continued to operate in the US, it would be only a matter of time before I was arrested. I rented a nice apartment, using the name Frank Williams. A week later, I dropped into a bank and opened a checking account for $500. I identified myself as a Pan Am pilot and gave as my address for the checks that of a mail service firm in New York. You see, the reason I want an account here is because I'm in and out of Chicago all the time on company business, and it's much more convenient to have an account in a local bank. The bank officer agreed. You'll receive your regular checks in about a week, Mr. Williams. In the meantime, here are some temporary checks you can use, he said. Observation. A great value for a con man, I've said. I had observed a very lovely teller when I entered the bank. Her image remained in my mind after I left the bank, and when she stayed in my thoughts over the next few days, I decided to meet her. I returned to the bank several days later to make a deposit and was filling out a deposit form I had taken from a counter in the middle of the lobby when an even higher power of observation took command of my mind. In the lower left-hand corner of the deposit form there was a box for the depositor's account number. I never filled in the box, for I knew it wasn't required. The cashier put a deposit form in the machine that printed stamped receipts, and the machine was programmed to read the account number first. If the number was there, the amount of the deposit was automatically credited to the account holder. But if the number wasn't there, the account could still be credited using the name and address, so the number wasn't necessary. There was a fellow beside me filling out a deposit form. I noticed he didn't give his account number. I spent nearly an hour in the bank, watching those who came in to deposit cash or checks. Not one used the space provided for his or her account number. I forgot about the girl. I secretly took a pack of the deposit forms, returned to my apartment, and filled in the blank boxes on each form with my own account number. The following morning, I returned to the bank and put them back to the counter in the lobby. I didn't know if my trick would succeed or not, but it was worth a risk. 4 days later I returned to the bank and made a $250 deposit. Your balance, including this deposit, is $42,876.45, Mr. Williams, the cashier said. Just before the bank closed, I returned and drew out $40,000 in a cashier's check, explaining I was buying a home. I didn't buy a home, of course, but I sure feathered my nest. The next morning I cashed the check at another bank and that afternoon flew to Honolulu, where a pretty Hawaiian girl greeted me with a kiss and put a flower garland around my neck. During the next 2 weeks I produced a $38,000 garland of fraudulent checks, spent 3 days hanging it around the necks of banks and hotels, and then flew to New York.